In the empty church, a lone figure in a black dress mourned the loss of Kyle, her last hope. Suddenly, she stumbled and collapsed onto the floor. The protagonist lifted her head, tears streaming down her face as the realization of Kyle's death sunk in. Her cries echoed through the church as she pleaded with God to bring him back, offering her own life in exchange. She said she was reborn as a character named Hestia. We learned that the girl fell asleep, and when she awoke, she found herself inside the novel she had been reading. Hestia was a simple but incredibly wealthy girl with no family. Such characters usually appear in stories for a reason, to change the plot. This extra character lived a carefree life, spending money as she pleased. Immense wealth bought status, and the protagonist became a noblewoman. Having acquired nobility, Hestia went to a ball where she met the novel's protagonist, the beautiful Diana. Diana was so beautiful that it made our protagonist's heart pound and took her breath away. But it wasn't just Diana who amazed the girl, but also crowned Prince Helios, who appeared as a main character. Hestia was delighted because at this ball she could see all her favorite characters. Callus, the second male lead who was in love with Diana, also attended the ball. Everyone Hestia dreamed of meeting was gathered at the ball, which she had spent a fortune to attend. Our protagonist was just an insignificant extra character, so she could only watch those she admired from afar, but that was enough for her. Diana was everyone's favorite, noble, beautiful, kind, and showing love to everyone. Of course, the two close friends we mentioned earlier immediately fell in love with such a perfect girl. There were also villains in this story, specifically Duke Oxyx and his daughter, Duchess Ratuna. Duchess Ratuna was not simple. She knew the power she possessed and used it, wanting to marry Helios and become empress. Diana became an obstacle for the Duchess, so Ratuna tried to harm and humiliate the poor girl, but the protagonist immediately stepped in to protect her. Through blackmail, Duchess Ratuna forced Helios to accept her marriage proposal, and the prince had no choice but to agree. As a result, Callus intervened in the marriage and committed a cruel act to help his best friend, Diana. Upon learning what Callus had done, Diana began to argue and yell at him, furiously ordering him never to appear before her again. This deeply hurt Callus. After that argument, Diana rejected Callus forever. The wedding day arrived, and the two hearts in love, Helios and Diana, were finally united. Hestia had been following the story for a year, and it was coming to a happy ending. The protagonist thought that if the story was over, she would be able to go home soon. Helios and Diana were very happy with each other. Although Hestia was happy for the protagonist's happiness, she was also worried about Callus. The protagonist wished Callus well, hoping that he would continue his life even with a broken heart. We learn that Callus did not attend Helios and Diana's wedding, which Hestia regretted as she couldn't see him. One last time, the novel was over, and it was time for the protagonist to go home. Although the protagonist had already said goodbye to her beloved Callus in her heart, fate brought them together again a year later. Callus looked at the protagonist sadly. Hestia met her beloved, but there seemed to be an invisible wall between them, preventing them from getting close to each other. The novel was over. The main characters were married and living happily. The protagonist prepared to return to her real life, saying goodbye to the rich and carefree life she had lived in the novel for a whole year. Soon, normal life would return. The girl would be reunited with her family and friends whom she missed very much, and everything would go back to the way it was. But Hestia's expectations were dashed. She did not return to her familiar world as expected. The girl still believed she would go back. She just needed to wait and fall asleep with hope. Day after day, week after week, month after month, a year passed, and she still couldn't return to the family and friends she longed to see. Hestia had lost all hope, and she didn't know what to do to return to her real world. The mountain cabin was all the girl had left, as she had donated all her wealth to charity, thinking she would be going home. In this strange world, alone, without family or friends, our protagonist no longer even understood if she was still alive and what would happen next. But what crushed the girl was not only the unknown, but also that Marquis Callus, whom she deeply loved, was still suffering and occasionally attempted suicide, fortunately without success. We learn that Callus, tormented by the loss of his close friend and the girl he loved, has been suicidal for a whole year, having lost the will to live. He's been rescued repeatedly, but the desire to leave this world never fades, while our heroine, Hestia, still hopes that one day he will find happiness. All Hestia wishes for is the happiness of the one she loves. Every night, the girl falls asleep dreaming of returning home and finally seeing Callus have the happy ending she so desperately desires for him. But every morning, the girl still sees the ceiling of the mountain cabin, trapped in an empty and lonely, unfamiliar world. Hestia is in utter despair, powerless over her own life, unable to understand why she ended up in this world where she knows no one. When you don't know what to do, you just start wanting to disappear from the world, disappear forever, and no longer suffer. Then, the girl sees someone she absolutely did not expect to meet. Frozen in shock, her eyes wide with surprise, her beloved Callus appears before the girl, their eyes meeting. It all feels like a dream. The girl never thought she would meet her beloved, convinced she would remain forever alone and unknown. But the happiness doesn't last long as Callus starts to leave and Hestia tries to stop him. She calls out to him, and Callus turns around, confused as to why an unfamiliar girl is calling him, waiting for her to explain what she needs. Having met her beloved, the girl feels reborn. Now she is no longer in such despair, still unable to believe this isn't a dream, overjoyed to see him. Hestia abruptly covers her mouth, preventing herself from uttering a word, becoming even more surprised and speechless. It turns out that Callus wasn't just taking a walk, but hiding from some people searching for him. The girl is surprised not by the search itself, but by the fact that her beloved is so close, practically pressing her tightly against himself, although this is also due to his attempt to hide. As Callus tries to figure out if he's been spotted, an embarrassed blush creeps onto Hestia's face, unable to move from the spot. Callus finally releases the girl, apologizing, while she understands that his apology is pointless, as she thoroughly enjoyed the way he held her tightly, willing to stand like that all day. A conversation unfolds between Hestia and Callus, with the girl trying to figure out who is looking for the man, and how she can help him a mountain cabin with a very confusing layout, a place that finally no longer feels lonely, as the girl has invited her beloved there. Callus worries about causing trouble for Hestia, unaware that she has known him for a long time. While the man worries about the inconvenience he's causing the girl, she can't believe her eyes, as the object of her affections is sitting right in front of her. The conversation between the characters continues, during which the heroine tries to find out all the information she's interested in. The man admits that he wants to disappear from this world, which throws the girl into shock and makes her nervous. Hestia understands him, as she also wants to disappear from this world in order to return to her own and finally see her friends and family. The young man notes how similar he is to the heroine, as they both cannot see the people they deeply love and miss. We hear the story of Callus's heartbreak again, but this time from his own lips, as he doesn't know that the heroine already knows everything about him. Life without friends and love is difficult, but the man still understands that death is not the solution for him. Callus admits his weakness and considers the heroine much stronger than him, as even when she feels bad, she doesn't want to die. The girl understands that her beloved, after the difficult events he experienced, hasn't gotten any better, even after a considerable amount of time. Unfortunately, with the passage of time, the man only becomes more grief-stricken. The girl, who has been watching Callus for a long time, immediately notices all the changes in him and the fact that he looks much worse. Hestia unexpectedly runs off abruptly, promising to return soon. The girl decides that the reason she is still in this novel is that she needs to help her beloved Callus, and she is willing to do anything to bring back his desire to live. Delicious food, sleep, walks, and good company might help the man feel better. Unfortunately, all dreams are shattered in an instant when Callus finds himself lying in a pool of blood next to a dagger, the culprit of all that has happened. The heroine finds him in this state, and all the things she bought for him also fall to the floor as the girl's hands immediately cover her face. Hestia can't believe she allowed this to happen, as she was only gone for a short while and was sure she could help her beloved. The girl completely breaks down as the last hope for the meaning of her existence in this novel shatters, along with her heart. People mourned the heroes passing for a day, then cheerfully put it all behind them and carried on with their lives, as if nothing had happened. They were able to forget this terrible news only because another piece of news overshadowed it. The scandal involving the novel's protagonist, Diana, and Helios, which shocked the court and the public. It turned out that the love between this couple had long since cooled, despite their 2+ years of happy marriage. With Salus's death, the girl's desire to live also dissipated, as everything lost its meaning. She didn't know how to get out of this difficult situation or what to do in this unfamiliar world. Hestia went to the temple every day, wandering aimlessly, as all meaning in her life was lost forever, and she had absolutely no idea what to do next. Everything in her life had taken a sharp turn for the worse, and there was nothing left to do but contemplate what had happened and what would never happen. To make matters worse, Diana's powers began to wane, and so we arrive at the moment where the story begins. The protagonist was praying in the temple for the gods to save her beloved, when suddenly everything went white. We see a richly furnished room and realize that the girl has returned to her former life. Hestia couldn't understand how she had been in the temple one moment and unexpectedly back in her old room the next. The protagonist felt incredibly well, which was just as surprising as her unexpected transfer. Then, Hestia understood what had happened and where she was, because she recognized the scene before her. It was identical to the night of Diana and Helios's wedding. Some unknown force had sent the protagonist directly to the end of the novel, and now she had to figure out why. It was on the day of the novel's protagonist's wedding that Salus first attempted suicide. Therefore, Hestia intended to take matters into her own hands and save him. The girl hoped that she still had a chance to save her beloved, and she didn't want to miss this opportunity. Diana always took Salus's care for granted and therefore never looked at him with the same loving gaze that he had for her. There were guards outside Salus's residence, and they were suspicious of Hestia, having no reason not to want her to see the hero. Even when the protagonist said she had important news to deliver to the young man, no one intended to let her in. But nothing could stop the girl, so they used a diversionary tactic, tricking the guards by saying that Saint Diana was behind them. The guards were fooled, and Hestia managed to get inside. The girl intended to prove to her beloved that Diana wasn't worth everything he was doing for her. As a result, the protagonist caught him just as he was about to commit suicide. Hestia was prepared to do whatever it took to persuade her beloved not to commit such a reckless act. Salus clearly hadn't expected this, and he froze, momentarily unsure what to do or say. The suicide attempt was thwarted, and all that remained was to convince the hero not to try again, because now he had a girl by his side who was willing to take care of him. Hestia decided to take matters into her own hands, and, instead of beating around the bush, she directly stated that she wanted to become the Marchioness for her beloved. Here, we meet Helios, Salus's butler, who took the place of the hero's parents and always looked after him. The butler, like our protagonist, hoped that Salus would overcome his heartbreak and move on with his life. However, Helios found the room in disarray, his master with a knife to his throat, and an unfamiliar girl who had broken into the mansion. On top of that, this strange girl had just proposed to the Marquis. This was something no one expected. The protagonist decided that she would never let Salus die again, so now she wouldn't just stand by and watch, but would join the game. But all the girl's confidence vanished the moment the Marquis spoke. However, instead of the expected answer, Hestia heard a sudden laugh escape her beloved's lips. Salus laughed at the whole situation and asked if he seemed that frivolous. Everyone was taken aback when a Marquis finally told the protagonist that she could have her way. This shocked the girl so much that she even wondered if everything that had just happened was a hallucination. The answer was so unexpected. Of course, this greatly surprised Hestia, even though she had been the one to suggest it, agreeing to marry a girl he had just met. Sounded completely insane. And after this conversation, the Marquis simply left, leaving the protagonist and the butler, who didn't even know each other, to deal with the aftermath. Salus wanted to relax and be alone for a while, so he simply dismissed his butler and the girl he had agreed to marry. Hestia and Helios froze, looking at each other, digesting everything that had just happened, as it was a shock to both of them. The situation was so unusual that it was hard to believe it was real and accept everything at once. After all these events, Hestia and Helios finally finally introduced themselves to each other and got acquainted. In a calm atmosphere, a casual conversation unfolded, allowing Helios to learn more about the person who was about to become his master's bride. The girl had expected to be scolded for trespassing on the Marquis's estate, but instead, she was met with gratitude for saving Silas's life. Helios, unaware that this unfamiliar girl knew the Marquis so well, was curious to know how she'd learned that Silas needed help. The girl had to come up with a reason for breaking into someone else's house within seconds. Most importantly, everything had to sound convincing so as not to expose herself. Blaming everything on superpowers was the easiest option, but it was unclear whether this would lead to negative consequences. With no time to come up with a more convincing answer, Hestia decided to say she could see the future. But judging by the butler's expression, he clearly didn't believe her. The girl decided to stand her ground and revealed a few things that no one else knew, proving she wasn't deceiving anyone and could see the truth better than ordinary people. Now Helios began to doubt whether she was lying, as she possessed information that almost no one knew. The girl perfectly remembered everything from the novel, which played into her hands, as it increased her chances of convincing the butler. Thus, Helios learned that this wasn't the Marquis's last attempt at suicide. To give up the life he no longer cherished. After the butler started listening to the girl, she promised to save Silas. The butler was completely stunned, but there was nothing left to do but listen to this stranger, as the life of his master, whom he had always cared for, was at stake. Hestia explained her reason for proposing to the Marquis, saying it was all just to save his life, as this way she could always be by his side and prevent any terrible consequences that might occur. The girl didn't need any riches. The most important thing was that her beloved was alive, healthy, and happy. This story wasn't convincing enough even for a novel, but there was nothing left to do but hope they would believe it. Fortunately for the girl, she wasn't kicked out and was even allowed to wait until later to discuss everything with the Marquis when he felt better. By the end of the conversation, it was nearing evening, so the girl was allowed to spend the night in a separate room at the Marquis's estate. After such a difficult and eventful day, Hestia could finally rest so that tomorrow she could try again with renewed energy to save her beloved. In one day, the girl had accomplished a lot, and now she just needed to continue in the same spirit to achieve what she wanted. But it wasn't only Hestia who was confused about what to do next, as Silas couldn't fall asleep at that time either. The Marquis was bewildered, completely at a loss for what to do and how to continue living, as in a short period he had lost someone dear to him, and now he had also agreed to marry a stranger. In despair, the man mentally asked his beloved Diana for advice. The girl was even surprised by her own reckless actions and still didn't understand how she had managed to do it. Only now did the girl realize what she had committed to, as a wedding was a rather significant period in everyone's life, and she had rushed into it with almost no second thought. But words couldn't be taken back, so Hestia had to accept reality, and the fact that she was just inside a novel completely calmed her down. The girl was still trying to convince herself that she hadn't intentionally wanted to become Silas's wife, although her feelings suggested otherwise. The girl's desires took a back seat, as the most important thing she wanted to achieve now was to save the life of her beloved, not to successfully marry him. Finally, the girl decided that she was ready to do everything possible to achieve her goal and help Silas. Hestia decided that her most important task in this novel was precisely to dissuade the Marquis from suicide. A mysterious voice suddenly told the girl that no matter what happened, they would always be with her. The dream ended with thoughts about who the voices that promised to help her were, as she always felt alone in this world. Having fully awakened, Hestia continued to think about the strange dream she'd had. Perhaps it meant something important. Then the butler appeared in her room, greeting the girl and asking how she had slept in this new place. The bed in the Marquis's estate was very soft, and the girl had slept well, which pleased the butler. Helios, being an attentive person, noticed Hestia's agitation and subtly hinted that she couldn't hide her state. After the routine conversation, the girl mustered the courage to ask about the condition of her beloved, whom she was very worried about. Although the butler replied that the Marquis was much better today, he was surprised, as the girl, supposedly able to see the future, didn't know this. The girl, Hestia, had to make up another excuse on the spot, this time saying she could only see major events. The butler, however, said he was only joking, putting Hestia in an awkward position. Trusting a girl she had only known for a day was difficult, but the fact that she had saved the Marquis couldn't be denied. Then, unexpectedly, the butler informed her that he had prepared documents at the Marquis's behest. Hestia immediately understood what he meant, but her first concern was that Helios had been working all night while she slept. A meeting with the Marquis was imminent, but she had to understand that he was in a fragile state, and every word had to be chosen carefully. Then, the girl surprised Helios again by asking him to bring something that Callus was very fond of, something only the Marquis himself would know. And his butler. After some deliberation, Hestia went to see her beloved. Although she was very worried about this meeting, she understood that the conversation would be difficult and had prepared herself in advance for a tough dialogue. Then, Hestia saw Callus. He seemed to have been waiting for her, staring intently at the door. It seemed that after seeing his heavy gaze, the last vestiges of hope for a casual, calm demeanor vanished. All the memories related to Callus's death in her past life suddenly flashed before the girl's eyes, but Hestia pulled herself together, knowing that if she tried, everything could be salvaged now. However, the girl's confidence and willpower didn't help her to speak, and an awkward silence hung between them. She understood that she couldn't even move, as the man she had silently admired for so long stood before her. After a long while, having made up her mind, Hestia sat down next to Callus, and they began to read the documents the butler had prepared for them. According to these documents, after signing, Hestia would have all the authority that Callus possessed, and she would also receive the title of Marchioness. The girl was surprised that the hastily prepared document was so thorough, a testament to the butler's competence. To prove her sincerity, Hestia refused the clauses in the contract regarding her rights to the Marquis's property and money. As a result, those sections were removed. While the girl and the butler were discussing the details, the Marquis signed the documents without hesitation, without even looking at them. Hestia and Helios were very surprised by this sudden turn of events, as they hadn't even had time to amend the document. But Callus's demeanor indicated that he didn't care about these formalities at all. He just wanted rest and quiet. This gesture once again showed how despondent the Marquis was at that moment, how meaningless life seemed to him. Every movement, every glance from Callus made the girl worry about him even more. She tried to cheer up her beloved, promising him that he would definitely not regret his decision. Despite her inner turmoil, she tried to show him her beautiful, radiant smile, hoping to improve Callus's mood at least a little. But instead of a smile in return, she received words asking her to leave and finally leave him alone. Thus ended the girl and the butler's meeting with the Marquis. They left his room, bewildered, pondering everything that had just happened. Callus's behavior left them both feeling heavy-hearted, and the girl began to contemplate one fact. She needed to go to the temple. The butler couldn't understand why the girl was so eager and asked her why she needed to go to the temple. Hestia explained that she wanted to go to the temple because she needed to return something to the Marquis, which puzzled the butler. According to the girl, she intended to return Diana first, as Diana was very important to the Marquis. Diana wasn't just an ordinary girl. She was a saint with divine powers. But it turned out that Diana hadn't always been considered a saint. Because of her commoner origins, her position in the temple wasn't secure. Thanks to Callus and his donation to the temple in the form of the most fertile lands, they helped Diana become a saint and attain a status that allowed her to live a long and happy life. Without Callus, Diana would have had nothing, but during a difficult time in his life, she abandoned him, breaking his heart. Hestia understood how unfair Diana had been to the man who had always taken care of her and helped her in everything. While the girl was lost in thought, she was already being taken to the very temple she so desperately wanted to visit, the temple where she wanted to help her beloved Marquis. The girl intended to talk to Diana and show her everything Callus had done for her, all of which she had taken for granted and hadn't noticed. Just then, an out-of-breath, unfamiliar young man interrupted the girl's thoughts. He turned to her, inquiring about the Marquis's carriage she had arrived in. But the Marquis himself was not by the carriage, and the mysterious hero, surprised, inquired about the whereabouts of Mr. Callus. Hestia, asked why the Marquis had arrived unannounced, replied that she would be taking his place at this moment, which shocked the already surprised fellow even more. But the shocking facts didn't end there, as Hestia declared herself to be Callus's wife, which the stranger clearly hadn't expected. Now it was the girl's turn to be surprised, as the fellow's reaction to the information received was nothing more than laughter. It turned out that Hestia wasn't believed at all, since everyone in the novel was sure that Callus would forever love only Diana, and no one could surpass her. But the girl didn't listen to the stranger's refutations of her words, and, following her plan, simply headed straight to where she needed to be at that moment. The heroine made it clear that she did not want to continue the conversation with the fellow, whoever he was. To stop the stranger from arguing, the girl simply tossed him a whole bag of coins. Hestia knew perfectly well how to subdue insolent fellows like this unknown young man. Realizing that her method had worked, the heroine said that she wanted to see the high priest, and the fellow, no longer daring to argue with her, immediately replied. He was willing to take her wherever she wanted to go. Now the girl was brought before another stranger who was willing to listen to her. But it turned out that this person was not the high priest she had asked for, and it was the high priest that the girl needed. It turned out that it wasn't so easy to see the high priest, but this young man, the one willing to listen to her, also held a high position. It was noteworthy that everyone in the temple was very interested in Hestia's claim to be the Marquis's wife, and now they were trying to get more information about it from her. Realizing that they wanted to test her, the girls started a polite conversation, saying that no one knew about the Marquis's marriage because they had only been married for a day. As confirmation, Hestia presented the marriage document and said that they could send someone to confirm the information with the Marquis himself. But even with all the evidence, they still didn't believe the girl, as everyone was sure that Callus would never stop loving Diana. Despite his disbelief in the heroine, the temple's servant decided to ask her the purpose of her visit, and then it turned out that the reason for her visit to the temple was Hestia's decision to return the lands that Callus had sacrificed for Diana. This land was very valuable to the temple, so this desire deeply offended the servant, to the point that he jumped up from his seat, losing all composure. They began to try to intimidate Hestia with the wrath of the gods, but this didn't frighten her in the least, as she understood that all the commotion was because of the value of the land, and that the land was given to the Saint Diana, not to the gods, so the talk of divine punishment didn't sound convincing at all. And the saint who had been given the land was no longer in the temple, so the girl decided to return the land to the Marquis, even though he didn't know about it. Hestia knew all about the temple's greed and understood that Saint Diana's land had been shamelessly seized by those to whom it did not belong. At this point, the temple's servant finally gave up, admitting that resolving such issues was beyond his authority, and decided to call someone of a higher rank. The heroine wasn't sure if any of this would work, but seeing the temple servant's reaction, she realized that everything she had said was true. While the girl waited, she thought about how much she wanted to show the whole world that Diana wasn't as perfect as many people saw her. Lost in thought, Hestia didn't even notice that the person she had been eagerly awaiting had quietly come up behind her. It was the high priest himself who finally appeared before the girl, and he already knew the reason for her visit to the temple. While the heroine waited, all the documents had been verified and their authenticity confirmed, so they now began to treat the heroine with more caution. Without much ado, the high priest asked Hestia directly about the land she so wanted to return. The girl reiterated her desire, reminding the high priest that the land originally belonged to the Marquis, and hoping that they had already contacted her and could now come to an agreement. However, the high priest let her know that he did not intend to return the land, and her trip was in vain. The high priest's answer greatly surprised the heroine, as Hestia hadn't even considered that she would hear a refusal to return the land. It turned out that the Marquis knew that the land of Ilion would not fully belong to Diana, as Hestia believed. But the girl decided that even if things had come to this, she had to see it through to the end, as she had already come too far to stop. Filled with determination, the heroine, once again demonstrating her strong character, decided to remind herself and others that she now held the title of the Marquis's wife. It turned out Hestia wasn't as simple as the High Priest thought, as she knew far more than they anticipated. The protagonist cleverly used her knowledge, for if all the temple's secrets were splashed across the newspapers, their entire legend, built on lies and greed, would crumble. The High Priest understood the precarious position he and the temple were in, so he couldn't even utter a word in response to the girl. His last chance to justify himself was to pretend he didn't understand what Hestia was talking about, but his demeanor made it clear he was on the verge of collapse. The girl noticed the panic in the High Priest's eyes and understood that no matter what he came up with, he couldn't bluff his way out. His great secret had been exposed. Finding herself in a position of power, Hestia could finally mock him directly. She also decided to discuss Diana's duplicity, how she, as a saint, used the Marquis's love for her own purposes. If one considered that Diana, despite her simple mind, became the Crown Prince's wife, things only looked worse. The nobles wouldn't be happy with this development, and the High Priest became even more nervous because of these words. While Diana had the support of the commoners, the nobles disliked those not of noble birth who simultaneously began to wield power like the saint. If the whole world learned of the terrible secrets of the temple and the saint, they would be in trouble. They would have a hard time coping. The High Priest's panic intensified with every word the girl spoke, as he understood more and more the real threat she posed, and he couldn't argue with her. It didn't matter to Hestia how cruel her accusations were, because she was ready to do anything for the sake of her loved one, so she calmly continued to threaten the High Priest. She was even prepared to go to the Emperor with this information, ready to exhaust all possible means to achieve her goal. The High Priest was still trying to salvage his and the temple's reputation, claiming the girl had no proof. But Hestia simply grinned at the priest's attempts to brush her off, confident in her victory in this argument. As a result, the temple's servants left, asking Hestia to wait a few minutes so they could discuss the current situation. The temple and its rulers were not without fault, so the Emperor's investigation and what it might reveal could severely damage everyone serving in the temple. So the girl was sure the High Priest wouldn't be able to do anything to stop her, as she was in a more advantageous position. The evidence Hestia spoke of didn't actually exist. She had simply succeeded in intimidating everyone so much that they didn't even try to verify it, believing her immediately. The protagonist understood the precarious position the temple was in, so she calmly began to state what she wanted, even treating the temple staff with a hint of mockery. Hestia considered her actions magnanimous, as she hadn't immediately gone to the Emperor, but decided to settle everything peacefully and quietly, without revealing it to the world. The High Priest accepted that he could no longer do anything against the Marquise, and he could only accept reality and agree to her terms. No one knew if he would take any further action to avoid handing over land so precious to the temple. The Marquise didn't return until evening, and the butler immediately greeted her with anxious cries of her name. Before she could even enter the house, Helios bombarded her with questions, wondering what she had been doing at the temple for so long. Then a document appeared before the butler's eyes, guaranteeing ownership of the Ilian lands, so precious to the temple. Helios was overjoyed, as this land was among the most expensive, and now it had finally returned to the Marquise. The butler and Hestia jumped for joy, knowing how difficult it was to reclaim the Ilian lands. But Hestia had succeeded, making both herself and Helios very happy. Callus himself stood by the window, watching the celebration from afar. Callus seemed to be avoiding the girl, not wanting to meet her eyes at all, quietly moving without making a sound. But even though he tried to hide, she still felt his gaze directed towards her. To somewhat alleviate the awkwardness between Hestia and Callus, the butler asked the girl to tell Callus the good news herself. It stood to reason that the Marquise herself should tell Callus everything, since it was thanks to her that the land was returned, but the girl was afraid to see him. As a result, the girl decided to have the butler tell the Marquis everything himself, as he, Callus, wasn't ready to see the protagonist. While Helios went to deliver the news to Callus, the girl would go to rest, as the day had been quite difficult and eventful for her. The Marquise was immensely pleased with herself, having set in motion the plan to save her beloved. Before going to bed, the girl had already planned what to do next. The first thing on her agenda was to inspect the land she had successfully reclaimed. Although Callus himself needed to survey the land, the protagonist wanted him to rest, so she intended to go herself. Lost in her thoughts, Hestia quickly fell asleep, exhausted from the day's events. While she slumbered, soundly asleep in the victory of acquiring the land, others began to worry about the news of the Marquis's unexpected marriage. One hero, even after reading all the documents, couldn't believe what he had learned, as he hadn't seen it with his own eyes. News travels fast, so there was no way to stop its spread. Callus was quite surprised that the girl had retrieved the temple's cherished land so quickly. Every time she saw her beloved, all of the girl's courage and resolve would disappear. At this moment, she sat awkwardly, unsure of what to say to him. Their conversation proceeded in this awkward and embarrassed manner, as the girl tried to apologize for everything she had done without the young man's knowledge. Although Hestia planned to inspect the newly acquired land, all plans were ruined as soon as the butler came to inform her that the Marquis was calling for her. The girl was very surprised that Callus would call for her, as he had always tried to avoid her before. The protagonist began to think that since Callus wanted to see her, he must be angry with her for reclaiming the land without his knowledge. It turned out that the Marquis had only just learned that his wife's name was Hestia and decided to confirm this with her. An awkward silence fell between the characters again, a common occurrence in their conversations, as they were not yet familiar enough with each other to communicate calmly. Their eyes met, and Callus no longer tried to hide the fact that he was looking at the girl. Then Hestia began to babble incoherently again, as she was still very nervous in the presence of her beloved. The protagonist noticed every little detail, even the fact that Callus was reading the newspaper she had bought him. The Marquis looked up from a newspaper and turned to Hestia, who immediately responded. Then Callus asked a question the girl hadn't expected, as he asked her why she wanted to marry him when they didn't even know each other. At this moment, Hestia faced a choice. She had to decide whether to tell Callus the truth or make up some kind of excuse again. The Marquis waited calmly and patiently for the protagonist's answer, while she thought about what to say to him. Without thinking, the girl told the hero that the reason was her hatred for the main characters of the novel, the Crown Prince and his wife Diana. Hestia understood that silly excuses wouldn't work on her beloved, as he was very intelligent and perceptive. So the girl honestly said that she wanted to help Callus and stop him from thinking about death. Helios and Diana had deeply hurt Hestia's beloved, and so she wanted to force them to apologize to him. The girl wanted the main characters to regret ever crossing paths with Callus's life. The Marquis was stunned by such a confession and now simply remained silent, pondering everything he had heard. Such a confession would shock anyone and make them think for a long time. Then it turned out that the butler had already told the Marquis about Hestia's gift of foresight, and it was all just a test. Callus was, of course, very surprised by what his butler had told him. It was certainly hard to believe, so Callus initially thought Helios should retire. But the butler's belief wasn't unfounded. He had proof that she knew things others didn't. The girl even refused the Marquis's fortune, which showed that she definitely didn't need his money. Hestia's behavior showed that she genuinely cared for Callus. The Marquis had finally met someone who didn't need his wealth or status, but only wanted to help him escape his suffering. Callus couldn't understand why a girl they had never met would do so much for him. Hestia didn't even know how to explain her desire to help Callus, since he had no idea he was her beloved. The protagonist understood that the truth would sound too strange and unrealistic, so she desperately needed to come up with a clear explanation, while Callus kept pressing her, insisting that she tell him her reasons for helping him. The protagonist was still trying to gather her thoughts to begin explaining everything. The girl decided to start her explanation by asking Callus if he liked what she had done. If the Marquis had any dissatisfaction with her, Hestia was ready to sign the divorce papers at that moment and leave his home. The girl realized that no matter the answer, she was always just an extra person to Callus, and if there was anything he didn't like, she could step aside. Hestia's answer greatly surprised Callus, leaving him momentarily speechless. Deciding against commenting on her words, he changed the subject, mentioning a letter from Helios. Since Hestia had initiated the situation, she would also need to handle it. Callus gave her full authority to do as she pleased. He wouldn't interfere. Understanding that no one would stop her now, and with Callus's permission, Hestia could finally avenge him. She immediately planned to meet with the Crown Prince. To lend credence to Hestia's claim, the Marquis wrote a letter of confirmation for her. Just as she had been unexpectedly summoned, she was now unexpectedly ushered out. The moment Hestia left Callus, Helios, the butler, rushed towards her. Although unaware of their conversation, Helios knew his master well and immediately apologized on his behalf. The butler's apology proved unnecessary, as nothing had happened. He then learned that Hestia was off again. She explained her intention to meet the crown prince, stating it was part of her plan. Ever the capable servant, Helios prepared to assist and support Hestia in all matters. He immediately began thinking about preparations for this important meeting. He wouldn't be the only one helping. To summon assistance, he loudly announced the Marquis's upcoming meeting with the crown prince. Hearing the call, numerous surprised maids working under the Marquis rushed over. Everyone rushed to help with such enthusiasm and excitement that Hestia was slightly overwhelmed. The maids worked diligently, and the final result of the Marquis's attire was so stunning that even Hestia herself was surprised. With such an important meeting ahead, Hestia needed to look impeccable, conveying her status with a single glance. However, she was surprised not only by her appearance, but also by the care everyone showed her, despite her recent marriage to the Marquis, and a very sudden one at that. This attention stemmed from Hestia's continuous efforts to help Callus, even returning his valuable land, earning her the respect of the Marquis's entire household staff. Hestia basked in the trust and admiration she received, surpassing even Diana, the most beloved saint in the entire novel. Filled with determination, Hestia went to meet the most beautiful people in the novel, the main characters. However, she later realized her overconfidence, as her beauty was far from comparable to Diana's. Seeing the main character's beauty, Hestia became apprehensive, but she understood the folly of fearing mere appearances and rallied herself. The main characters greeted her with neither particular friendliness nor warmth. Hestia immediately inquired whether they had met her before. She then recalled her first encounter with Diana in the novel. Back then, Diana's attire was simple, lacking the elegance she now possessed. Diana was considered a saint, capable of healing any ailment with a mere smile. She rightfully held the title, known for her kindness and willingness to help anyone who sought her aid. The saint's humility, kindness, and beauty captivated everyone without exception. Unfortunately, over time, Diana had changed, losing the qualities Hestia had initially admired. When asked if they had met, Hestia replied that they must have mistaken her for someone else. Inwardly, Hestia relished this charade, as the couple remained oblivious to her plans and her true identity. The main characters led their guest to a magnificent room, befitting a meeting with the crown prince himself. Without delay, Hestia presented her marriage documents and a handwritten letter from the Marquis. To confirm her legitimacy, the couple immediately recognized Callus's handwriting, assuring them that Hestia was not an imposter. Diana reread the documents, seemingly in disbelief. No one had anticipated Callus's marriage, as his love for Diana had been unwavering, even after her rejection. Furthermore, Callus wasn't one to make rash decisions, known for his rationality. However, all evidence pointed to Hestia's truthfulness, leaving them no choice but to accept the reality. Callus was married. It was an undeniable fact, proven by the contract, the letter, and the Marquis's carriage that had brought her. Hestia was pleased that the crown prince and Diana finally believed her. When they saw all the evidence, extremely surprised expressions appeared on their faces, which Hestia found quite amusing. The crown prince began the conversation, addressing Hestia and acknowledging her as the Marquise, though his words implied he still didn't fully believe her. He also spoke about how Hestia had abused her power, seizing the temple's land and threatening them. To this, Hestia replied that there were no threats, and she didn't understand what they were talking about. But Helios insisted that it was absolutely a threat. However, Hestia was prepared for this conversation, and she immediately responded that it wasn't her who abused power, but rather the temple, as they had privately encroached upon the land donated to Diana. At this point, Diana joined the conversation, stating that the temple had no private property, so there was no question of land encroachment, as everything offered to the temple belonged to the gods. Hestia then had a question she wanted to ask Diana personally. If that were the case, why did the saint only serve the royal family? The saint had stopped helping the common people, hiding behind the palace walls and its wealth. Diana had abandoned the commoners, even though she was once one of them. But the powerful had distanced her from her origins. Now, the saint wasn't saving everyone like she did at the beginning of the novel. And was she truly using the power bestowed upon her by the gods according to their will? Because she had turned her back on the people who needed help. Diana couldn't even think of anything to say in her own defense, because she knew Hestia was right. Then, her husband came to the saint's rescue, telling Hestia to watch her words. Hestia decided to change tactics, playing the victim, but at the same time, she pointed out that she hadn't even asked the crown prince, yet he answered for his wife, not letting her speak. The Marquise's next question was whether the crown prince wanted Callus to donate his land to the temple for the saint. Hestia said the Marquis had admired Diana, and that was the sole reason he donated the land. Hestia made it clear that Callus's feelings for Diana were in the past, referring to it as an old love. As a result, the couple was speechless at the Marquise's words, for everything she said was true. They knew it too. Hestia's plan was to explain all of her beloved's past actions, so he could quickly let go and move on. Although Hestia said she didn't mind the crown prince and his wife, in her heart, she challenged herself, wanting to avenge her beloved. After this conversation, Helios looked very upset. He was clearly not happy about Hestia's visit. The crown prince didn't understand how Hestia could have married Callus, especially the day after his wedding to Diana. Then Hestia began to explain to them that people are different, and not everyone marries for passionate love like the crown prince and the saint. But Helios still didn't understand why Callus, who was always surrounded by girls from noble families, chose Hestia. Hestia couldn't understand how someone could treat others so poorly, picking people as if they were objects. Then Hestia decided to inform the lovers that she, like Diana, also possessed supernatural abilities. Hestia told them she could see the future. As Hestia expected, the crown prince wouldn't believe her without proof. But Diana was shocked because she had always been convinced that she was the only special person in the world, but that wasn't the case. To prove her point, Hestia decided to predict the future. Callus, upon hearing this story later, was very interested in what she had told them. Hestia replied that she predicted the capture of a notorious thief who had been troubling the entire imperial capital. Hestia shared that the crown prince didn't believe her and called her a liar. Then Callus asked what Diana had said, as Hestia had mostly talked about the crown prince. Hestia began to talk about the saint, feeling very nervous because she knew about Callus's feelings. Marquis Callus listened carefully to everything his wife told him. Hestia noticed that since Callus asked about Diana, it meant he was still thinking about her. But the young man was happy that the land he had long forgotten was his again. For this, he thanked Hestia, as it at least made him feel a little better. The Marquis moved very close to Hestia, saying he wanted to express his gratitude. He got so close that Hestia even started to feel shy, as Callus usually kept a greater distance. And Hestia herself hadn't expected any thanks, as seeing her beloved and helping him was enough for her. Hestia had a very vivid imagination, and she had already begun to envision what Callus might do to thank her, to the point that she became even more nervous because of these thoughts. While Marquise Hestia was lost in her thoughts, Callus could only guess what she was thinking. As a result of the Marquise's impatience, he once again clarified what she wanted so he could at least somewhat understand her thoughts. Hestia hadn't expected any thanks, so she didn't even know what to ask for. Finally, she decided to hire a tutor, and her choice took the Marquis by surprise. She asked Callus if he had anyone in mind, as if hinting at something. She said she wanted to ask Lady Harmony of the salon. For some reason, Callus confirmed whether it really had to be her, as if he wasn't satisfied with the choice of tutor. Hestia was surprised by Callus's reaction, as it was just an ordinary tutor, yet it evoked so many emotions. This was because Lady Harmony was originally the noble closest to Diana, which offended Callus. Then we learned that they only began to treat Diana well after Callus poisoned 2 ladies who opposed the saint. But in the novel, even now, Lady Diana is not loved by everyone, and many nobles continue to secretly hate her. Despite many nobles being unfriendly towards Diana, Hestia, for some reason, chose a tutor who, on the contrary, liked the protagonist. Lady Harmony was one of the few nobles who had been kind to Diana from the very beginning. She supported the saint in every way and helped her. It was Lady Harmony who taught Diana court etiquette and always encouraged her not to give up on her love. She was the saint's mentor. Hestia understood that Lady Harmony wouldn't be able to restrain herself and pretend to be unaware of what was happening and would definitely want to discuss it. And Diana, in order not to put herself in a precarious position, had to win the support of the nobles as soon as possible. Therefore, Hestia decided to win over Lady Harmony before Diana. All of this was to avenge her beloved. Callus eventually agreed, realizing he couldn't refuse her as he wanted to express his gratitude, and a promise couldn't be taken back. From Hestia's behavior, it was clear she had something in mind, but Callus still didn't understand what she was up to. Callus felt Hestia's support and was very grateful for everything she had done for him. Hestia was glad that Callus noticed all her efforts, as it meant that everything she did wasn't in vain. Hestia was happy that Callus expressed his feelings to her, even if it was just gratitude. She was also pleased that the Marquis no longer addressed her so formally. Hestia went to sleep in a pleasant mood because all her efforts were not wasted. The next morning, Hestia asked the butler to contact Lady Harmony. She wanted her to be her tutor. The prospective tutor expressed her wish for the lessons to be held at her house, and Hestia could come over whenever it was convenient. Hestia planned in advance how she should behave in front of the lady to make a good impression. Since Hestia had read the novel she was currently in multiple times, she knew each character's preferences and was completely confident in this. And so, encouraging herself, Hestia went to visit Lady Harmony. But Hestia didn't expect the meeting to be arranged so quickly, and she was already standing at the tutor's door. The house looked like a magical cottage, and a smiling, rather friendly young man greeted her. She was asked the purpose of her visit and her name, and she introduced herself as Marquise Hestia. The other people in the house, upon hearing who she was, immediately began whispering and gossiping. Hestia felt all eyes in the room on her, which made her uncomfortable because she wasn't used to such attention. She guessed that everyone already knew everything about her and what she had done. Hestia's only thought was to get away from all these stares as soon as possible. Then, like a lifeline, Lady Harmony appeared, which made the Marquise very happy. The lady led Hestia into a separate room where there was no one else, and Hestia was very grateful for this. Lady Harmony was surprised that the Marquise had come herself, as usually, people of high birth would invite the lady to their home, not visit personally. To this, Hestia replied that all of this was simply to demonstrate her serious attitude towards Diana. The lady was charmed by her honesty and humility, so Hestia decided to act in a similar manner to win Lady Harmony's favor. For effect, Hestia even started to cry to impress her tutor. Lady Harmony immediately rushed to her side to help, trying to calm her down and offering assistance. For Hestia, it was all a game, and so far, her plan was flawless as she successfully played the role of someone in need of help. Hestia began talking about Lord Ellie, supposedly her stepfather, and we understand that she fabricated some sort of legend for Lady Harmony. Despite buying her title, the girl began to tell Lady Harmony a completely different story about how she was adopted in order to enter high society. Just like that, she spun a carefully crafted tale of woe to her tutor, presenting it as her own lived experience. Hestia ended the story by saying she lacked a lot of knowledge because the title of Marquise came too suddenly. She was now at a loss. Everything the girl said surprised Lady Harmony, who was deeply touched by the fictional story. Hestia temporarily transformed into the kind of person Lady Harmony would definitely like, embodying all the virtues, and all of this was done so that Lady Harmony would agree to help her and take her side in the future. However, Lady Harmony did not immediately agree to help as Hestia had hoped. Instead, she fell into thought as if unsure of something. The girl had already begun to wonder what she had done wrong, but it turned out to be much simpler, as the lady simply didn't understand how the Marquis had married Hestia. During this time, the lady's thoughts were entirely focused on how Callus had taken a wife. If Lady Harmony asked this, it meant that she had taken an interest in Hestia and her fate, which was exactly what the protagonist was striving for. Then the girl said that she had long admired the Marquis and had always worried about him, dreaming of being able to help him. Lady Harmony was delighted by the Marquis's heroic act of saving Callus from the pain of heartbreak, and now the girl wanted to repay Callus with kindness for agreeing to become her husband. It was clear that Lady Harmony was very fond of this heartbreaking story. The girl even went to the temple for her beloved because she was so kind and grateful to Callus. The girl also showed her humility, saying that she was well aware of her place and understood that she was far inferior to Diana. And so, the girl successfully won Lady Harmony's favor. After listening to Hestia's story, Lady Harmony concluded that she was ready to help a girl in a difficult situation. Lady Harmony immediately ran off to create a training plan for Hestia, we are sure. She is a wonderful character. Lady Harmony began to teach the girl everything she knew, which was quite difficult for Hestia, as the amount of information was overwhelming, but all of this was necessary for her plan. A few days later, the maid Clarice brought news that the bandit the protagonist had predicted had been caught. While the maid rejoiced at the capture of a dangerous criminal, Hestia was doing her endless homework. If the girl's prediction came true, it meant that Diana and Helios would have to believe that Hestia could predict the future. Although the protagonist's plan was going well, she decided to ask how the Marquis was feeling, which visibly made the maid nervous. It turned out that Callus currently had a guest, which surprised the girl, as he didn't seem to be in the mood to receive anyone now. Without thinking, the girl asked if the guest's name was Hyperion, which greatly surprised the maid, as it was indeed true. Hyperion was no ordinary person, as this was actually the name used by the crown prince to conceal his identity. As soon as Hestia learned this, she immediately ran to her husband. The crown prince had come to the Marquis's mansion in broad daylight, and no one had even informed Hestia, which angered her. At the entrance to the Marquis's room, the protagonist ran into the butler Helios, who explained that he was at the door only because he was worried something might go wrong. Hestia told Helios that he didn't need to apologize, as she understood him perfectly. The butler told the girl that so far nothing but conversation had happened. Then they heard some noise and ran into the room, where the girl found Callus bleeding from his hand after hitting the glass. The girl immediately ran to her beloved and asked him what had happened. Meanwhile, the butler began calling for a doctor, while Hestia was trying to help Callus. Helios approached him, but before he could say anything, he was driven away by the protagonist, who accused him of being responsible for what happened to the Marquis. After listening to the girl, the crown prince left, finally apologizing to Callus. It was clear that the Marquis was in great pain, but there was nothing to do but wait for the doctor. Callus received medical attention and was now lying in bed, his wife sitting next to him. The wound was not deep and was caused by the Marquis hitting the glass in a moment of emotional distress. The girl was curious about what Callus and the crown prince had talked about. The Marquis thought the girl had foreseen his meeting with Helios, to which she replied that she couldn't see such details. It turned out that Callus didn't want to receive the crown prince, and he admitted that if it were up to him, he would never see him. When Helios came to see the Marquis, he began inquiring about his well-being. In response, Callus asked the crown prince if his honeymoon had been enjoyable, but the protagonist of this story, the crown prince, wasn't planning on answering, as his visit was solely for questioning. The crown prince immediately began trying to discuss the Marquis's wife, who he found quite suspicious. Callus believed that being cautious in life was pointless, so it didn't matter who he married or how wrong he was. Helios then heard a confession that left him disheartened, as the Marquis admitted he'd wanted to die on the protagonists, referring to the crown prince and Diana, wedding day. He added that Hestia had saved him and questioned why the crown prince should care who Callus chose to marry. Helios felt offended that Callus hadn't shared his pain with him, as they were friends and should be able to talk about anything. The crown prince once again made the Marquis feel guilty, adding that Callus had changed a lot and that Diana would be pained to see him like this, as she worried about him. Mentioning Diana was unnecessary, as the girl hadn't sent a single letter, which further upset Callus. Now we know what truly angered the Marquis, as talking about Diana was a bad idea. When Hestia and Callus were alone, the young man decided to open up to her and tell her why he had wanted to take his own life. He admitted that at first he was upset that he hadn't died, but ultimately, thanks to her, he had come to understand many things. Meanwhile, Helios told Diana that their mutual friend Callus had decided to commit suicide on their wedding day, but Hestia had stopped him. Diana began to worry. There was too much evidence of Hestia's supernatural abilities. Diana worried about Hestia's supernatural abilities. So, the Crown Prince and the Saint, Diana, decided they had to uncover the true intentions of Callus's wife. The scene then shifted to the ladies' tea party. Hestia was also there. We learned that a few days prior, the Marchioness Hestia had received an invitation to Countess Irene's tea party. Countess Irene turned out to be a prominent figure, her authority no less than Lady Harmony's. The protagonist, Hestia, understood that she was invited solely due to the Countess's curiosity about her, but she was still very nervous because if she messed up, she would be in trouble. The protagonist's main problem was that she knew almost nothing about Countess Irene, as she was only a minor character in the novel. Even Lady Harmony noticed the girl's nervousness and wanted to help her handle the situation. Even though Hestia didn't know how to behave properly in front of Countess Irene, she couldn't simply refuse the invitation, and the protagonist was ready to do anything to help Callus. These words surprised Lady Harmony. Even in such a difficult situation, she was still thinking of her husband. She couldn't refuse the invitation because rumors would spread afterward, so that option was impossible. But fortunately, Lady Harmony was willing to help her navigate the situation. That's how the girl ended up attending the tea party. Hestia was very worried because she was among strangers and didn't even know how to behave properly. Then the girl, Hestia, focused all her attention on the Countess, Irene. Fortunate that she still remembered a few tricks Lady Harmony had taught her. Although the Countess might look down on Hestia, Lady Harmony had taught her some manners that could help the protagonist please all the ladies at the tea party. The protagonist needed to appear humble and polite, saying what the ladies wanted to hear. Flattery helped Hestia charm everyone at the tea party. The girl answered all the questions directed at her, but the way she told everything amazed the ladies. Then Hestia was asked how she felt about Callus's long-standing affection for Diana. Lady Harmony had also mentioned such a presumptuous question and had instructed the protagonist on how to answer it correctly. Everyone expected Hestia to be furious at the question, but she was prepared and controlled herself. Although the tea party was difficult for the girl, it was useful for her, as she learned that many ladies disliked Diana. The girl also aroused the interest of others because she had been to the Imperial Palace, which earned her even more respect. Hestia's advantage was that she had a diary that recorded all the major events in the original story, so the protagonist knew all the important moments that were about to happen. Now the girl was making plans for her next steps and how this diary could help her. Then the protagonist remembered a moment that would surely shock Diana and deal her a heavy blow. Early in the morning, Hestia had already rushed to find Callus, wanting to tell him her plan and ask for his permission. But then the girl began to doubt whether she could just walk straight into Callus's room. In the end, she simply found Helios and asked him to announce everything for her. She finally met her beloved and told him she wanted to visit the Crown Prince's wife, Diana. The Marquis asked whether Diana had invited her or if she had decided to visit on her own. The answer he received was that, after Hestia had informed him of her plan, the visit was her decision. She had anticipated his reaction, but he simply accepted it without comment, despite Hestia expecting any reaction other than this superficial one. It seemed the hero no longer cared about Diana. He was even surprised that the girl had to trouble Helios for such trivial news. The Marquis hastily suggested that she not bother the servants with such small matters in the future, that she could come in directly anytime. The issue had originally been raised by the butler, who inquired whether the Marquis could approach Callus directly instead of having a servant announce her. The hero was surprised, as the heroine had previously entered his spaces unannounced, and now Helios was involved. Thus, the butler requested the master personally permit Hestia to approach him whenever she needed him. Callus assumed this permission would please the Marquis, but he expressed it so casually that the girl only became dejected. This was all because she believed she was merely inconveniencing others, as she was now troubling Helios for her own comfort. Then, as Callus, assuming the girl had finished with her inquiries, prepared to leave, Hestia requested to borrow the ring with the pink diamond before she departed. The girl began to try her best to persuade the Marquis, promising to treat the ring with care and only borrow it for a day. But her beloved replied that she should wear the ring always, and gave it to her. Callus gave the girl the ring, much to her surprise, as he no longer had a mistress. The diamond on this ring was chosen to match Diana's soft pink hair, and for the Marquis, it was a precious wedding gift he wanted to give to his beloved. Hestia's gratitude was beyond words, as this ring was very precious to her husband, and he gave it to her. Callus noticed that, as the heroine left to meet the saint, her expression was as if she wanted to kill someone. The heroine sent a letter requesting an audience with the crown princess and received a reply almost immediately, then went to the meeting. The girl had devised a perfect plan to put an end to Helios and used the ring to accuse Diana. Hestia was still incredibly happy with the first gift from her beloved and didn't care who the ring was originally intended for. It had been intended for Diana, and this ring gave the heroine hope that her husband had given up his feelings for Diana. At that moment, the Marquise's thoughts were interrupted by Diana, who arrived and apologized for the wait. The girl's plan was beginning to come to fruition, and she was already anticipating seeing the saint's twisted face. Hestia thanked the crown princess for agreeing to the meeting, and Diana replied that it was all due to her curiosity, pretending she wasn't interested in their conversation. In her thoughts, the heroine was displeased with being treated with disdain, but still told the saint that she assured her of her good attitude. Then Diana noticed the ring that was originally made for her, but ended up with the Marquise, who immediately noticed the ring had been recognized. The girl eagerly awaited the protagonist's reaction, but in the end, she only received a radiant smile, as if the saint was pretending not to notice anything. But Hestia wasn't so easily fooled. She still noticed the saint was affected by the ring and was merely feigning composure. Suddenly, the heroine handed Diana an envelope containing a letter for her. The letter detailed what the crown prince should prepare for in the future, as the girl had proven her ability to foresee the future. The Marquis spoke of the enemy army preparing to attack the country after scouting the defenses. Last time, Helios had faced much trouble because of this attack, but this time everything would be different because Hestia had warned him. And last time, people gossiped that Helios had agreed to peace under very unfavorable conditions, while Callus would have handled it much better, as he was an excellent diplomat. The saint was surprised that such important news was told to her, and not the crown prince. To this, Hestia said she wanted to know when the crown prince planned to hold his next tea party, which angered the saint. Diana began to say it was too much, because the date and guest list of the tea party were confidential. Lady Harmony's teachings were not in vain, as the heroine was quickly able to feign regret for what she'd said. Diana quickly realized her mistake, as the information about the tea party was far from the information Hestia had brought. It turned out that the date of the tea party hadn't been chosen yet, but as soon as there was any news, the saint would immediately send a letter to Callus's wife. Afterward, Diana reminded Hestia that she was the crown princess of this country, so she wouldn't tolerate such treatment, as more politeness was required when addressing her. Hestia saw how much the beloved saint had changed, as she now possessed the power to change people. Then Diana, unable to contain herself any longer, inquired about the ring. Hestia immediately began to boast and praise Callus, intending to embarrass the saint, as Hestia spoke of her husband's thoughtfulness and how he managed to acquire such a rare gem. Diana wrestled with whether or not to reveal that the gift was originally intended for her. Hestia, noticing the saint's paling complexion, asked if it was because the gem Hestia displayed wasn't magnificent enough for her, making her situation even more difficult. The crown princess stammered, trying to formulate a response, while Hestia continued, mentioning that the gem's color was remarkably similar to the saint's hair, making matters worse. Then the Marquise seemingly guessed that the ring was meant for Diana and exclaimed her surprise, anticipating Helios's wife's reaction. But Diana remained silent, making no mention of the ring being made for her, which puzzled Hestia. However, Hestia didn't stop her inquiries about the jewelry, pretending to be deeply hurt by the whole situation. The saint rushed to comfort the Marquise, saying that Callus meant no offense and harbored no ill will. Diana, cast in the unusual role of an antagonist, then began to apologize to Hestia. The crown princess thanked Hestia for saving Callus's life, to which the Marquise replied that she was happy to help someone important to her. Hestia noted how strange Diana's demeanor had become as she struggled to speak, eventually including a plea for Hestia to protect Callus as much as possible. Hestia was pleased that she had managed to upset the crown princess. Upon returning, the Marquise immediately recounted her meeting with the crown princess to the butler. Hestia knew that the Marquis read light novels when he was upset, her knowledge of Callus once again surprising the butler. After speaking with the butler, Hestia immediately rushed to tell her beloved everything, and the first thing he asked about was Diana. Then, remembering Hestia's ability to foresee the future, Callus asked if the saint would be happy in the future, a question that stumped Hestia. The Marquise realized she couldn't answer this question yet, knowing that the saint would soon lose her healing abilities and cease to be the saint. The last time Callus died, the country faced a crisis. The protagonist's marriage began to crumble, and Diana lost her gift and her status as a saint. After that, everyone distanced themselves from Diana, as she became an ordinary girl, and the crown prince, weary of political problems, paid her little attention. Hestia faced the dilemma of whether to tell her beloved everything or keep it a secret. She worried that Callus might return to Diana, and he, as if reading her thoughts, replied that he no longer had feelings for the saint, but the Marquise understood that this was all a lie. Then Hestia decided to tell him that Diana would soon lose her healing ability and cease to be a saint, which shocked Callus. Hestia confessed that not only Diana, but she herself would also lose her abilities. She would no longer be able to foresee the future. Callus speculated, rather bluntly and pointedly, that his wife would lose her abilities due to death, but Hestia admitted she wasn't certain of that. Less than 2 years remained until the end of Hestia's memories, but she wasn't worried about it, as the most important thing for her was having the time to complete all her planned tasks. And there was no need to worry about Diana, because even if she lost her abilities, she herself would be safe. The Marquis' abrupt departure, telling Hestia to forget their conversation and leave immediately, left Hestia worried that she had said something wrong. Afterward, Hestia went to see Lady Harmony, who noticed Hestia's poor complexion, the result of several sleepless nights due to the lack of news from Callus and Diana. Lady Harmony guessed that Hestia's poor condition was due to her visit to the Crown Princess. Then Hestia told Lady Harmony the story of the ring. Hestia expressed her concern that Diana was trying to drive a wedge between her and Callus, attempting to portray the saint as two-faced in front of Lady Harmony. But Lady Harmony defended the Crown Princess, saying that she was incapable of such cruelty, as Diana was a loyal and helpful person, implying that it was all a misunderstanding. Then Hestia realized that Lady Harmony was very fond of Diana and couldn't be swayed against the saint. Finally, Lady Harmony decided to request an audience with Diana to speak with her personally and clarify the situation. The lady calmed down and returned home, but this truly exhausted Hestia, who went to the garden to clear her head. A chance encounter occurred in the garden as the girl stumbled upon her beloved holding a bouquet of flowers. After the heroine appeared in Callus's life, he felt much better and even began studying floristry. The butler did his best to support his master, bringing him many flowers so the Marquis wouldn't give up on this endeavor. We learned that Callus received a letter from the Crown Prince, stating that thanks to Hestia's prediction, a border crisis was averted, saving the country. Callus couldn't understand why the girl would save him. With her powerful ability to foresee the future, using her prediction on a Marquis she didn't even know. Upon meeting Hestia in the garden, Callus presented her with a bouquet he had personally picked and arranged as part of his floristry studies. The girl was quite surprised, as he had never given her flowers before. Then Callus added that he had something to tell the heroine. At this moment, Hestia's composure began to crumble, captivated by her beloved's kindness. The Marquise started wondering where her husband got the bouquet from, but she still refused to believe he would give flowers to her. However, noticing the girl's gaze fixed on the flowers, Callus concluded she liked them very much and decided to give them to her. Hestia was overjoyed, and even Helios came running to assist. Thus, the girl discovered her beloved's newfound interest in floristry, and that he wanted to talk to her. But seeing her state, he decided to postpone the conversation. However, the Marquise persuaded him to continue, currently admiring the bouquet made by her husband. But then she remembered that this scene wasn't in the novel and began to worry. The young man noticed the change in the heroine's mood, attributing it to anxiety. Due to his thoughts, Callus began to smile, which Hestia noticed, and although she didn't know why, she was glad he smiled. Then Callus tried again to tell the girl the important news, even though she thought their conversation had ended. The Marquis wanted to know why the girl saved him, as there must have been a reason. As a result, a misunderstanding arose where Hestia assumed Callus had guessed her affection for him, while the protagonist himself believed he was an important figure in the future. This led to an awkward silence as the heroine inadvertently revealed all her feelings to the Marquis, thinking he already understood, while Callus himself simply asked why she called him her beloved and what it meant, clearly not fully grasping what he had just heard. Hestia realized she had misspoken and now didn't know how to get out of the predicament she had created. Callus began to delve into the meaning of the word, trying to understand what it meant to be called beloved. Unable to withstand the Marquis's probing gaze, the girl admitted she called him her most beloved person. The Marquis tried to salvage the situation, but it was too late, as no matter what she said, everything pointed to her being in love. However, the protagonist decided that Hestia was in love not with him, but with the flowers, and promised he would give her flowers more often. Thus, the heroine narrowly escaped, much to her relief. Afterward, they began a conversation where Callus wanted to discuss something, and it turned out the topic of discussion was the Marquis's abilities. Callus began to reason that Hestia could change the present, thereby changing the future, and if events were changed repeatedly, this would be very useful, and the future would change because of it. This was a very important moment for the characters, as everything that happened last time could change. The Marquis remained convinced that the heroine saved him only because he would be useful in some important event in the future, but due to Callus's death, he hardly influenced anything. Only the heroine herself believed that if he were still alive, everything would be much better, so she couldn't agree with his question. Due to Hestia's prolonged silence, the Marquis assumed the heroine was simply finding it difficult to talk about it, while in reality, she was just pondering the best response. Hestia admitted that if she hadn't saved him that day, nothing would have changed. Afterward, the Marquis began to think his life was meaningless and couldn't change anything, meaning it was all pointless. So the Marquis again began to contemplate death, as he decided there was no point in continuing to live, that he wouldn't change anything or become someone outstanding or great. Hestia understood what Callus was talking about, as he was a secondary character, meaning he wasn't as important as the main characters, who received almost all the attention, while the rest simply lived in their shadow. But the heroine decided to persuade the Marquis, telling him that he didn't have to change the world to become great, as simply being the meaning of someone's life was enough. Hestia admitted that Callus was the meaning of her life, and she considered him great because she loved him. The butler, hearing his mistress crying, came running to find out what had happened to the heroes and what they were doing, while also informing them that dinner was ready. Then the Marquis started laughing loudly, startling both Hestia and the butler, who couldn't understand what had caused the outburst. The Marquis immediately remembered that, in the novel, Callus only laughed when he was with Diana. Hestia assumed he was laughing because she had made a fool of herself, but as long as he was happy, she was willing to accept it. Finally, Callus stopped laughing and turned to Helios, saying he had something to ask him, to which the butler immediately responded. Callus's request was for the butler to provide a pleasant dinner for him and his wife, Hestia. The girl was so worried, however, that she couldn't even taste the food that was served. But even in such an awkward situation, the heroine was glad that Callus had left. She saw a different side of him and hoped that, thanks to her, the Marquis was feeling much better. The girl thought she could finally sleep properly without worrying about anything. But when Hestia entered her room, she was stunned by what she saw and froze in place. The girl saw something she clearly hadn't expected to be in her room. The Marquis's room was filled with flowers. Astonished, she wondered what it all meant. Then the girl saw the bouquets Callus had made and realized it was his doing. Hestia remembered that, before this, her beloved had promised that if she liked flowers so much, he would give her more. Now it was clear what exactly the Marquis had asked the butler for. But the girl decided it was definitely not Callus who had asked for so many flowers to be delivered. It was Helios' own initiative. Regardless of whose idea it was, the heroine was pleased with such attention. While Hestia admired the flowers, Callus stood in his room, thinking about everything that had happened earlier. And so we see the girl working again, this time writing a short note about the current situation, as Diana hadn't replied and the heroine couldn't contact the Countess either. It turned out there was going to be a banquet, and the Marquise wasn't sure if they were ready to host it. The banquet letter was already written, and all that remained was to send it and find Helios, as she couldn't arrange the flowers herself. There were simply too many. But Hestia was incredibly pleased, as now she could admire them all the time. But Hestia didn't find Helios, only a table piled high with documents. Because of the sheer volume of paperwork, the girl didn't even notice the butler among them at first. Helios looked extremely tired and unwell. He only said that his master should be taken care of, although it seemed that he himself needed care first. Then the heroine started trying to wake Helios up to bring him to his senses. When he came to, Helios admitted that due to the heavy workload, he was sleeping less than 3 hours a day. While Hestia worried about Helios, he worried that he looked disgraceful, not even considering that he shouldn't burden himself so much. Since his master couldn't handle his own affairs, the butler had to do it for him. But Hestia noted that Helios had been fine until yesterday and asked what had happened. It turned out that the butler only dealt with urgent matters, and before this, he had never had a situation where he slept only 3 hours a day. Surprisingly, Hestia had made Callus laugh, as his laughter was rarely heard before, meaning the heroine could somehow command the Marquis. In this situation, Helios invited Hestia to take charge of the estate's housekeeping, but the problem was that the girl had never done anything like this before. The girl also thought the young man wouldn't allow it, to which Helios said he was ready to go and ask him right now. At that moment, the Marquis himself was having a tea party on his terrace. As soon as Hestia learned about this, she immediately disappeared, having instantly run to her beloved. While important matters were being resolved, Callus sat alone on the terrace, leisurely drinking tea. The hero asked the Marquise what had happened, and she replied that she had come running because an urgent matter had arisen. In response, Callus invited the girl to join him for tea. He was just about to pour it. Hestia was, of course, delighted, but then realized there was no time. The heroine had to run, so at that moment, she could barely speak, as she needed to catch her breath first. When Hestia refused the tea, Callus asked if she liked tea. She answered in the affirmative, and then began to think how she could refuse tea with her beloved. But the Marquise didn't let her think, telling her to forget about the tea and sit down, as she needed to talk. Hestia was very upset about refusing tea with her beloved, but there was nothing she could do. Hestia was upset about missing her chance, and when Callus asked her why she had sought him out, she noticed his gaze soften, losing its usual coldness. The Marquis was starting to look at her differently, but then Hestia realized his gaze wasn't soft, but rather studying, as if she were some strange insect. Still, it was better than the lifeless look he usually wore, a sign that Callus was improving. Sitting across from her beloved, Hestia wished she could forget yesterday's events. Finally, she collected her thoughts and remembered to tell the Marquis about Helios's wish for her to take over the estate's affairs. Callus, knowing the butler had a lot of work, wasn't surprised by the suggestion. It was difficult for Helios to do everything himself. The Marchioness thought it implied he had been neglecting his duties for a long time, but she insisted she wanted to help him. Help him, that is. If the Marquis objected, she wouldn't insist. Then Hestia heard Callus admit that previously he hadn't been able to entrust his work to others, doing everything himself. But now the Marquis was living comfortably and couldn't understand why he hadn't allowed himself to live this way before. Hestia wanted to ease Callus's burden and help him with everything. Callus found this unusual. Few people had ever shown him such care. They sat opposite each other, lost in their own thoughts. Finally, she managed to persuade her beloved, and he allowed her to help the butler. Callus then decided to share his news, mentioning a letter he had received from Helios. Hestia wasn't pleased that Helios needed something from Callus again, as their last encounter had ended in tears. But after seeing the contents of the letter, Hestia realized it wasn't addressed to Callus at all. The letter was for the Marchioness herself. The Crown Prince wrote that he wished to meet with her, as her abilities had been of great help to him. Hestia only wanted to use her knowledge for her beloved and considered refusing the Crown Prince's invitation outright. Before refusing, However, she decided to ask the Marquis for his opinion on the matter. Callus didn't understand why she needed his advice, but she explained that she was now the Marchioness and the letter was from the Crown Prince, and the fact that they were secretly seeing each other could lead to many strange rumors. The Marquis was amused by her confidence that he wouldn't find out about the secret meeting. The Marchioness was so shocked by Callus's words that she seemed to forget how to breathe. It took her a moment to understand the meaning of everything her beloved had said. She was indignant. She didn't want to do anything without her beloved's knowledge. Hestia was also unhappy about having to meet with the Crown Prince, as he had offended Callus. Meanwhile, Callus silently pondered everything his wife had just told him. He recalled the day Diana confessed her love for another, his best friend, Helios. The saint had claimed no one could dislike the Crown Prince, yet here was a girl who couldn't stand him. It was clear Hestia was struggling with whether to accept Helios's invitation, as there was much at stake. Meanwhile, Callus reflected on how different Diana and Hestia were, and a faint smile touched his lips. The decision was made when Callus said it would be best for her to go, and she decided to accept the invitation. The Marchioness had been addressing her husband formally, so he couldn't help but ask if it bothered her. He asked her to call him by his name, as no one called Hestia the Marquis's wife, so there was no need to keep calling him Marquis. His words made her blush, and the proximity of her beloved only worsened the situation. Hestia uttered the Marquis's name for the first time, her voice quiet and timid, as if afraid of saying something wrong. When she realized nothing bad would happen from saying his name, she let go of her fear and shouted it with all her might. Callus, taken aback, watched as Hestia recovered from her outburst. Afterward, she quickly retreated, leaving the Marquis to his thoughts. It seemed her shout had startled him considerably, even causing him to spill his tea. He only just noticed. Hestia had once again brought a smile to his face, which meant her plan was working. The Marquis was getting better. Meanwhile, embarrassed, Hestia tried to get as far away from her beloved as possible to avoid further awkwardness. The focus then shifted to Helios, who was looking around Hestia's room as if he were visiting a museum. Hestia wasn't particularly thrilled about meeting with the Crown Prince, but she was compelled to agree. Helios wasn't coming as the Crown Prince, but as a representative of Hyperion, so I had to meet him in my room, not in the open drawing room. Helios's scrutiny of her room never ceased, and Hestia was starting to become quite annoyed. Then, the Crown Prince noticed Hestia's documents on the table and asked if she was in charge of the Marquis's internal affairs, to which Hestia replied affirmatively. The Crown Prince was surprised to learn that the Marquis possessed many surprising talents. Then, Hestia was offered the opportunity to use her powers to serve the country, as she had once saved the nation. But in response, she simply said she would pretend she hadn't heard those words. The Marquis explained that, for her husband's health was paramount, so she would focus on caring for him and managing the household. Although the Crown Prince tried to convince her that household matters were less important than national issues, she stated that her precognitive abilities had nothing to do with state affairs. Helios then asked why she had revealed the information about the attack, and the Marquis replied that it was to obtain information about the date of His Highness's tea party. He tried to threaten Hestia, but she pointed out that today she was meeting with Mr. Hyperion, not the Crown Prince, so she was unafraid. He considered it incredibly selfish of her to use her powers solely for personal gain. Hestia pointed out that the Crown Prince had abandoned his friend, her husband Callus, leaving him alone, and now she couldn't help but think about it, as she loved Callus very much. His Highness was trying to figure out how to gain the upper hand in the conversation, as the person he was speaking with was rather blunt. Then, after taking a sip of tea, Helios suddenly started coughing. It turned out that the tea tasted exactly like Diana's. Even a saint had flaws, such as not knowing how to brew tea, producing only tasteless water. At first, Hestia was offended that her tea was compared to the worst tea in the entire novel, but then she tried it herself, and all indignation vanished. Regardless, Helios didn't want to lose the knowledge the Marquis possessed, so he asked what she wanted. She then requested the lands of the deceased Duke Oaks, and the elevation of her husband's status and title. Hestia wanted to show that she was the complete opposite of Diana, while emphasizing that Callus was not responsible for the death of Duke Oaks' daughter. It was curious whether the Crown Prince would fulfill these requests for valuable information. But to answer this question, it was necessary to consult with the Emperor, as Helios himself couldn't decide. She didn't care about all this, as the most important thing was that her requests were met, and only then would she share her abilities. Although Helios understood that it would be difficult to find justification for fulfilling these conditions, he agreed and was even prepared to provide a written promise to fulfill them. The Crown Prince's acceptance of the conditions without further explanation greatly pleased her. Despite everyone looking down on Hestia, she planned to elevate Callus to the pinnacle of this empire. The next day, the Marquise finally received a letter from Diana stating the date of the tea party. As soon as Hestia received Diana's letter about the tea party, she immediately went to Countess Irene to inform her. The Countess was flattered by the Marquise's personal visit, and so the two ladies developed a good rapport. It turned out that Diana wanted to meet with all the nobles at once, as she wished to hold such meetings as infrequently as possible. If there were many people, then the Crown Prince's wife would likely need Lady Harmony's help. The Countess didn't like the idea of another lady wielding the same influence in secular society. Hestia, realizing that the Countess liked her, decided to take advantage of this. Then, she said she didn't understand why the Countess was helping Diana with such an important event. The Marquise once again benefited from flattery, telling the Countess that Diana would be better off choosing Irene to assist with such an important event. The Countess replied that she thought so too, and was therefore glad to have found someone who understood her so well. However, Her Majesty the Queen didn't trust the nobles because of last year's flood, as they hadn't taken proper care of the citizens during that time. The saint first appealed to the king for help for the people, but after getting nowhere, she turned to the nobles. The nobles couldn't do anything, and then Helios and Callus helped Diana. It was while caring for the flood victims that Helios's love for his current wife blossomed and solidified. At that time, Callus was handling documents in the Crown Prince's stead. Hestia added that if the Countess wished, the protagonist could create a few cracks in the walls of His Majesty's castle. They devised a plan. The Marquise would make Diana look bad at the tea party. Then the Countess would step in and save Her Majesty, after which the Countess and the Queen's relationship would improve. In exchange, Irene had to become Hestia's protector in the secular world, like a companion. The Countess was still considering the Marquise's proposal, but the young woman was sure Irene would agree. All the socialites were now on the Marquise's side, which pleased her. Moreover, when she returned home, she received Helios's appointment letter and a royal pass, meaning His Majesty likely urgently needed the protagonist's talents. The next step was to find out how Diana's reception preparations were going, which Hestia could inquire about while going for her prophecy. She could even talk to the servants then. Hestia then began to choose an event to prophesize about, so she could go to the royal palace as soon as possible. But before telling Helios this prophecy, the Marquise first decided to share everything with her husband. Thinking that tomorrow everything would go as smoothly as today, Hestia fell asleep. The next day, the young woman couldn't understand how she and her beloved ended up in a carriage together. It turned out that she had gone to tell Callus about her plans again, and he asked her if she was going to the castle. Before that, the Marquis was styling his curly hair, which surprised Hestia as he did it quite well. Callus reiterated that his wife didn't have to report everything to him, but she explained that she didn't want the information she was going to tell Helios to be a secret just between her and the Crown Prince. But what could she do? If her beloved didn't want to hear what she had to say, she added, then she wouldn't say anything at all. However, the only thing that bothered the Marquis was that Hestia called him Mr. Callus, which he found strange since she could just call him by his name. Callus wanted to know what information the protagonist would tell the Crown Prince first, and she said it would be the news of His Majesty's impending death. It turned out that His Majesty was suffering from an unknown illness, so Diana was pouring all her healing powers into him. Diana worked day and night, and the moment the Emperor passed away, the saint would use her power for the last time. It was unclear whether this news could somehow prevent what was about to happen, but everyone would be prepared for any outcome. Callus had lost his parents at a young age, so he, along with his close friend Helios, deeply respected and was loyal to the Emperor. And His Majesty treated Callus as his own son and was very pleased with him. At that moment, the Marquis said he would go to the castle with his wife. The protagonist was still in shock because of her beloved's sudden decision. However, the young woman was not only surprised, but also very scared, as she didn't know how Marquis Callus would act when he met Diana. The Marquis seemed to see through his wife's thoughts and told her not to worry about his feelings for Diana being rekindled, as he was going to see his majesty, not his former lover. Hestia explained to her beloved that how he felt wasn't crucial to her. The most important thing was that he didn't repeat the mistakes she had witnessed him make. After all, she herself might disappear in 2 years, but for now, her goal was to make Diana and Helios regret their actions. Callus decided they could go their separate ways and return at different times. But the Marquise was worried that her husband might get sick and she wouldn't be able to help him then. This offended the man, as he wasn't a child and wasn't so weak that he couldn't handle things himself. In the end, they did go their separate ways. Hestia noticed how similar this behavior was to that of the Marquise in the original novel. Lost in her thoughts, she suddenly overheard a conversation between several maids, who were discussing the scale of Diana's tea party. The servants were dissatisfied with how the tea party was being organized, and the Marquise realized that something was clearly wrong. Then one servant blurted out that she was tired of watching Lady Miraculously and Diana argue every day. Lady Miraculously was a lady-in-waiting who had served the late Empress and was the most senior figure in the palace. Hestia was pleased to see Diana at odds with a woman so important to the royal court. In a good mood, the protagonist went to see the crown prince, who was surprised by her quick return. As she was thinking about how to more carefully reveal the information about his father to Helios, he scolded her, asking if it was proper to stare at people so intently. Due to the crown prince's rudeness, Hestia abandoned her attempts at subtlety and bluntly stated that His Majesty the Emperor would soon pass away. Helios argued, claiming the physician hadn't found anything wrong with his father during the last examination. Hestia added that she didn't know the exact cause or date, only that she had foreseen it. The crown prince asked if there was a way to prevent it. Hestia replied that while she couldn't guarantee anything, she advised having someone constantly by the emperor's side, ready to provide immediate assistance. Despite the saint using her divine powers on His Majesty every night, the fact that he was nearing death proved that even with divine support, every life has its limit. Then, Zeno, the head steward of Lily Palace, appeared, saying His Majesty had summoned him. Helios ordered him to go to the emperor immediately, adding that he himself would also be there soon. Helios wanted Diana to see his father as well, but Hestia stopped him, knowing Callus was currently there and not wanting him to see Diana, the woman who had broken his heart. Diana, it turned out, had already gone to have tea with the emperor. As Helios and Hestia hurried to the Imperial Palace, the crown prince wondered if his father's death could be caused by poisoning, alluding to how terrible Diana's tea was. Meanwhile, Hestia was rejoicing at the thought of finally being able to speak with His Majesty. At that moment, Diana noticed someone she least expected, Callus. What Hestia feared had happened. Her beloved Callus had met Diana, the woman he had loved for so many years. A while later, Marchioness Hestia ran to the palace. Upon seeing her, Callus said he had told her not to come. However, Callus then noticed Crown Prince Helios had also run to the palace with Hestia, which displeased him. Marquis Callus grabbed Hestia's hand, wanting to leave quickly. Hestia realized her beloved Callus had finally seen Saint Diana. She couldn't imagine how he felt, only speculate, as he showed no outward signs of distress. Hestia tried to comfort Callus, saying he was holding up well. He misinterpreted her words, saying she knew nothing, as her abilities couldn't see into people's hearts. After hearing his words, Hestia apologized, knowing he just needed to vent. That night, Hestia decided to have a few drinks, thinking she shouldn't have let Callus go to the palace. She understood that Diana had likely been indifferent towards him during their time together. After the encounter, Callus remained silent for the rest of the day. While Helios attended to him, Hestia wanted to check on him, but was afraid. Callus's office was close, visible from the balcony, but his heart felt incredibly distant. Then Hestia noticed she wasn't the only one outside enjoying the night sky. Thinking Callus might be contemplating suicide again, Hestia rushed towards him. As she ran to her husband, she encountered Helios, who said Callus just wanted some fresh air. Relieved, Hestia was about to leave when Callus called out to her, and Helios excused himself. As Hestia felt nervous about Helios leaving her alone with Marquis Callus, he stepped closer. He wanted to apologize for being harsh with her earlier that day. A shy Hestia asked how he was feeling. Callus replied he had taken a short nap and felt better. With Callus so close, Hestia felt flustered, clearly seeing his handsome features. He asked why she wasn't looking at him, and she admitted it made her even more nervous. Marquis Callus then mentioned seeing her drinking on the balcony, having witnessed her emotional outburst and undignified drinking straight from the bottle. Instead of reprimanding her, Callus invited her for a drink. Hestia felt like she was dreaming, sharing a late-night drink with her beloved in his office. Hestia decided to take the opportunity to admire Callus, her face flushing at the thought. Noticing her blush, Marquis Callus approached, wondering what was happening. To dispel the romantic atmosphere, Hestia asked her husband how Diana had reacted upon seeing him. She immediately realized it was a bad question, but Callus had already begun to speak. The saint was startled for a moment, but quickly recovered and began treating her old friend as she had before. Later, the crown princess and Callus went to see the emperor together, but Callus barely spoke to his majesty because the saint captivated all of his attention. Callus was disappointed because no matter what he did, Diana treated him the same as before, meaning all his efforts to change things were in vain. So Hestia, unable to bear it any longer, said that everything done in the name of love could never be in vain. After all, Callus knew how to love, and that was where his happiness lay. Then, the protagonist promised that she would do everything in her power to make him happy. As the girl was about to leave, Callus initially wanted to say something to her, but then changed his mind. So Hestia decided that since they had something to say to her, they should continue the conversation the next day. But the Marchioness's plans were not destined to be realized, as she had many things to do, including studying land management and Lady Harmony's lessons. As the girl lay thinking about all her affairs, she suddenly remembered that she had forgotten one important thing: choosing a dress for the tea party. Since all the tailors were busy because of the tea party, Hestia decided to alter a dress herself. After all, everyone at the tea party would be looking at the protagonist's appearance, so she needed to look great. In the end, Lady Harmony supported this idea, and she also recommended a tailor named Decuma to Hestia, who, despite looking intimidating, was very skilled. The problem was that Decuma was a commoner, which puzzled many. But this didn't matter to Hestia, because the most important thing was skill. The protagonist showed the tailor the dress she wanted to alter and some jewelry that might be useful. After that, Decuma began to bombard the girl with questions about what kind of dress she liked. But the protagonist just said to let the tailor decide everything, the most important thing being that it looked good on her. Then Decuma suddenly said he had the perfect sketch in mind and ran off to draw it. While talking to Hestia, Harmony began to praise what a wonderful girl she was and how much she had achieved. Then the lady's words touched the protagonist, because Harmony noted that it would be nice if the crown princess could act like Hestia, but even after all the rumors about Diana, the lady still trusted her. Then the tailor burst in again, telling the ladies that he had come up with many ideas for the Marchioness. Decuma, bursting with inspiration, drew too many sketches and then asked the protagonist to choose her favorite. The tailor was very worried about whether the Marchioness would like it, and had already begun to think that she was dissatisfied with everything. And all this time, Decuma's shirt buttons were undone, and when he noticed this, he became even more worried. All the sketches were beautiful, but for Hestia, there always seemed to be something missing, because all the dresses looked like something a noble would wear. Then the girl saw another design, but the tailor said it was just a practice sketch, yet in the end, the protagonist chose this one. After a while, preparations for the tea party began, so Callus's mansion was very noisy, which he greatly disliked. Then Eulos explained to the Marchioness that everyone was busy because Hestia was going to attend Her Majesty the Queen's tea party that day. Then the steward told Callus that due to the tight schedule, the Marchioness had to alter her existing dress, even though she wanted a new one. So the Marquis said that the protagonist should have asked him for help, and he would have solved everything with money. But Hestia had said more than once that she didn't want to use her husband's fortune. Finally, the dress was ready, and the girl looked breathtakingly beautiful in it. Despite everyone's previous concerns about altering the dress, all the worries were unnecessary. When Hestia thanked the tailor, the maids were surprised that the dress was made by such a person, because it was so elegant, and this did not match Decuma's physique. The design of the dress was the simplest of all the patterns shown, so they even tried to dissuade her, thinking it was not suitable for Her Majesty the Queen's tea party. But Hestia insisted, because she wanted an elegant dress to complement herself. To prevent the dress from looking too plain, It was decorated with crushed mother-of-pearl shells. Although the idea was great, Decuma had to work very hard to bring it to life. It could even be said that the tailor poured his whole heart and soul into the creation. Hestia thanked Decuma profusely for the dress and said she would ask for his help again next time. As they were talking, Callus came up to them and said that the door was open. It was the first time the Marquis had come to his wife himself, so it startled her because she thought something had happened. Callus first examined the dress, finding it seamlessly altered. The Marquis then gave Hestia a large sum of money to give to the tailor, enough to open his own shop. Callus left immediately after giving her the money, offering only a brief farewell. Hestia was so beautiful, yet her beloved hadn't said anything to her about it. She understood. He only ever complimented Diana's beauty. Suddenly, the Marquis turned back and, looking at her, said the dress suited her. Hestia, however, took the compliment as mere courtesy, a formality upon parting, not a genuine sentiment. Satisfied nonetheless, she thanked her beloved for his encouragement. In front of Helios, Callus began to make excuses, claiming he had only checked on Hestia's dress to avoid damaging his reputation, nothing more. At the tea party, the Marquise encountered Countess Elinus. The Countess noted Hestia's good mood and was herself full of anticipation, having promised to be a loyal ally to the Marquise, though unsure if it was the right thing to do. The event itself was held in the Emperor's main palace, as Helios had heeded Hestia's advice to ensure someone was always by the Emperor's side. Then, the Crown Princess, Diana, appeared, capturing everyone's attention. Hestia, meanwhile, thought that perhaps another day would be a better time to reveal the novel's protagonist's true nature. As it turned out, due to her status as Marquise, she was seated at the same table as the Crown Princess. Everyone was exceedingly kind and flattering towards Diana, which Hestia greatly disliked. Listening to all the praise directed at the Crown Princess, she realized it would be difficult to find the right moment to speak. At first glance, everyone seemed genuinely fond of, even admiring of Diana. Hestia tried her best to make eye contact with the saint, but failed as Diana continually averted her gaze. Then, desserts, prepared by the Crown Princess herself, were served. Diana seemed to want to convey a message by criticizing the nobility's extravagance, but she would never persuade anyone that way. No matter what Diana did, everyone praised her. As a result, the saint had lived a life strewn with flowers, far removed from any hardship. Suddenly, the Marquise realized that the Crown Princess did all this to remember her commoner origins. Though the desserts evoked memories for Hestia, they appeared somewhat rustic to others. Hestia then asked Diana if something had happened with Lady Mellop, as her touch was missing and the lady herself was absent from the event. Diana began to explain, saying she simply wanted to do things her own way to make the tea party unique. These words, however, failed to convince anyone. In the end, only Hestia supported the Crown Princess, saying that everyone would surely understand the deeper meaning behind Her Highness's actions. Diana then told the Marquise to dress more appropriately next time, demonstrating her ability to retaliate against Hestia's words. Hestia wasn't sure whether to respond to Her Highness or simply ignore the comment. Just then, Elinus came to the Marquise's aid. She tapped twice on her saucer, a signal that Hestia could say what she wanted and the Countess would interject at the appropriate moment. Hestia then explained that it was a misunderstanding. The dress was reworked from one of her favorite outfits. Its shimmer came from crushed seashells, not gemstones. Though surprised to learn the dress was altered, its beauty overshadowed this fact. Finally, the other ladies began telling Hestia that they couldn't take their eyes off her. The dress was stunning. Everyone was particularly impressed by the seashells, and they all began asking who her tailor was. Hestia then admitted that the tailor was a commoner. At that moment, Elinus remarked that she would never have guessed the masterful dress was made by a commoner if she hadn't been told. The Countess then added that she, too, would like to commission a dress from this tailor. After the Countess spoke, everyone supported the idea of reworking dresses, leaving Diana perplexed, as her own dress had cost a fortune. If the Crown Princess intended to serve simple refreshments, she should have done so in an aristocratic manner, and then the idea would have been successful. But Diana had made a mistake in this regard, and thus no one supported her. The Countess then asked Hestia why, As a marquise who could afford beautiful and expensive dresses, she would choose to rework a commoner's garment. Then, Countess Elinus pointedly asked if Callus had generously allocated a budget to his wife. Hestia, not expecting the question, was momentarily silent. She pondered the question. Hestia's surprise was feigned, as she and the Countess had previously agreed to steer the conversation towards Callus. Hestia began to speak of her husband's complete respect for her, carefully observing Diana's reaction. As Hestia spoke of respecting her husband, Countess Elinus recalled how the Crown Prince had once publicly criticized the Marquise's coldness. This stemmed from the incident where Callus had attempted to poison Duke Callus and his daughter to aid the main character, leading the Marquise to distrust her beloved, having done wrong. Then Hestia asked Diana her opinion and whether she believed Callus had erred. It was important to note that the Marquis committed this crime not only for someone he cherished, but also because the Duke Callus family was one known for shameless acts, such as selling children into slavery and murdering those who defied them. By any means, Callus acted alone, forbidding Helios from assisting him to avoid implicating the royal family. The Marquise explained to the Queen that the Callus family posed a threat to the throne, potentially inciting rebellion, and thus civil war was averted. To this, Diana replied that the ends do not justify the means, and that regardless, Callus had committed a heinous act against imperial law. Hestia then inquired why, if her husband had committed such a terrible crime, he hadn't been punished. The saint found herself in a difficult position, with no easy answer to the question. Countess Elinus then interjected on Diana's behalf, stating she was under no obligation to answer, as it could potentially upset the emperor. Hestia then apologized for any offense caused to Diana and expressed her hope for forgiveness. Countess Elinus' defense of Diana was also part of Hestia and Elinus' plan, so the protagonist cheerfully excused herself to clear her head. Leaving the tea party, the Marquise finally relaxed, knowing she would return promptly at its conclusion. As Hestia rested and enjoyed the fresh air, she was startled by the approach of the Crown Prince. The Marquise wondered why Helios was approaching her, sensing a purpose behind it. She was so perplexed that she didn't even greet him, a fact he later commented on. Helios asked why the Marquise was sitting alone while Diana's tea party was still in progress. He inquired if something had transpired between them, suspecting the two weren't getting along. Hestia then countered by asking why he was also alone. It turned out the prince was on his way to the tea party. When it was her turn to answer, she explained that she had been disrespectful to the crown princess and needed to clear her head. Helios became concerned, asking what Hestia had said to offend Diana. Hestia replied that she was merely trying to restore her husband's honor. Initially, the prince assumed she was using Callus against Diana, but she clarified that her actions stemmed solely from love for her husband. Hours earlier, as Hestia departed for the tea party, a letter arrived at Callus's residence, summoning him to the imperial palace to discuss Aeolian's rights. Callus knew he had to go, but the thought of potentially encountering Diana again made him uneasy. He decided to visit the emperor on a day he was certain Diana would be occupied with the tea party. After a considerable wait, Callus finally met with Emperor Arius. It turned out he hadn't been summoned to discuss Aeolian, but rather his wife. The Marquis assured the emperor that while his wife could be impulsive, she cared for him deeply. The emperor remarked on the girl's evident love for the Marquis, surprising Callus, who found it difficult to believe someone he barely knew could love him. He remained puzzled by Hestia's motivations. Upon returning home, Callus was surprised to find his wife not at the tea party, but conversing with Crown Prince Helios. At that moment, she declared her love for her husband to the prince. The prince, however, remained skeptical, given their unfamiliarity before the wedding. He pressed Hestia to explain her deep affection for Callus. Seemingly prepared for this question, she answered thoroughly, eloquently describing everything she admired and cherished about him. The crown prince had already started trying to stop Hestia, but she didn't want to stop, saying she still had things left unsaid. And these words were heard by the very person they were directed at. Then Callus began to think that maybe this girl really did love him. Afterwards, Hestia and Helios went to the tea party. Even then, she couldn't say anything to Diana because her husband was nearby, so the rest of the time passed relatively smoothly for the saint. As a result, Hestia decided to ask Countess Elinus to gauge public opinion about Diana. Hestia was thinking about how she would be able to go home soon when, suddenly, she couldn't believe her eyes. She saw her beloved. So the girl immediately ran to Callus, and asked him if everything was all right and what he was doing there. The man replied that he just had some business with the emperor and therefore decided to wait for her so they could go home together. At the end of his words, Callus affectionately called the girl Hes, which made her heart almost explode. But despite her immense happiness, Hestia still didn't understand why Callus was suddenly so tender towards her and was waiting to ride with her. Then the Marquise also realized that she hadn't told her husband a word about where she would be or where he should wait for her. When the couple arrived, Callus wanted to help Hestia out of the carriage. He extended his hand to her and once again addressed her affectionately. As a result, Hestia, mustering her courage, gave her hand to her beloved, thanking him for his help. After that, Hestia was so happy that she didn't even remember what she did upon arrival or how she got back to her room. As a result, she immediately went to bed, leaving everything for later, including her diary, which she wanted to organize and use to make new plans. While Hestia fell asleep with pleasant thoughts, Diana, at the same time, was worried that she was indeed wrong and continued to think about what had happened at the tea party. Diana pondered why Callus hadn't really been punished, then added that she was speechless at the Marquis's words. After all this, the Crown Prince asked his wife if they should reconcile with Callus, as they had once been best friends. However, Diana wasn't going to forgive Callus. Although both of them owed the Marquis a debt of gratitude, she didn't want to abandon her convictions. The Crown Princess ended up crying, and her husband immediately rushed to comfort her and apologize for bringing up the subject. The next day, Helios brought Hestia 2 letters, one from Lady Harmony and the other from the Crown Prince. While the lady's letter was expected, Helios's letter was a complete surprise, as he had no reason to write to her yet. The prince's letter said that he had heard about everything the Marquis had done to Diana at the tea party, so Hestia had to come and apologize to the Crown Princess. Of course, Hestia was displeased that the Crown Prince was ordering her to apologize to Diana. She even crumpled the letter in anger. Despite the fact that, thanks to Helios, the tea party ended well, rumors still circulated that the Crown Princess still despised the nobles, which is why such a curt reception was arranged. The girl hadn't anticipated the Crown Prince's interference in her attempt to turn public opinion against Diana. At first, the Marquise simply ignored it all, but she realized that she could actually be arrested for insulting the royal family. So Hestia decided to go and see Diana first, thinking about how tired she was because she had so much to do. Seeing that the Marquise's mood had worsened because of the letter, the butler decided to distract her and cheer her up with various trifles, such as tea or coffee. While Helios ran to bring the tea, Hestia decided to read the letter from the lady. The contents of the letter stunned her. Meanwhile, the maid took the tray from the butler, saying it was her duty and she would bring the tray to the Marquise herself. The argument between the servants was in vain, because Hestia hurriedly ran off somewhere, not caring about any tea. It turned out that Hestia ran to Callus to tell him some very important news, while the Marquis was painting. He hadn't expected anyone to come. The reason for Hestia's haste was that she had learned that the temple had begun to publicly criticize the Marquis over the land issue, saying that Hestia was blinded by profit and disregarded human decency. Even if the nobles opposed Diana, the Crown Prince and the temple would stand firmly behind her. Hestia began to think about what she could use against the temple, then remembered that in this novel, the temple's most important initial role was to heal people, as only nobles had doctors. Then the protagonist realized that people would only stop going to the temple when they stopped getting sick, and personal hygiene could help them achieve this. To share this idea, the Marquise ran to her husband and explained that if people started washing their hands with soap, which was previously only used by nobles, they would get sick much less often. If they started producing soap without essential oils or fine threads, it could be sold to commoners at a low price. Originally, Hestia suggested that Callus open a soap factory so that as few people as possible would go to the temple, after which the temple's status would begin to weaken. However, it turned out that the protagonist decided to handle all of this herself, not wanting to involve her beloved, but since she was the Marquise, she came to get permission to act on Callus's behalf. Then the girl added that she also needed startup funds to launch a new business, but her money wasn't enough. Then the Marquis explained to Hestia that this wasn't necessary, as there was a functioning workshop in Ilion. He He suggested that if she liked, she and Callus could go to the territory together. Hestia was surprised that her beloved invited her to travel with him. Callus noticed how happy and excited the protagonist was with this offer. She couldn't even believe it was happening. But since the Marquise didn't respond to the offer for a long time, her husband thought she simply didn't want to go. However, Hestia immediately refuted Callus's thoughts, explaining that her hesitation was only because she didn't want to disturb her beloved's rest. Apparently, there were rumors among others that the Marquis was ill. Therefore, his wife did everything for him, so he had to appear somewhere anyway. After hearing these words, Hestia thought that she was managing the estate poorly, but her husband reassured her, praising the protagonist because all the residents were very grateful, and Callus himself was also grateful. The Marquis thought that the protagonist reminded him of his past, when he was willing to do anything for love, so he decided to reciprocate her efforts, offering to go this week. But there was an obstacle in the protagonist's path, Diana, who was waiting for an apology. Although Hestia would gladly choose the trip, she might get into trouble that way. Then the protagonist decided that she needed to ask for forgiveness as soon as possible so that she could go on a trip with her beloved with peace of mind. Diana, greeting Hestia, said that she didn't even think the Marquise would apologize, so she was surprised that the girl requested an audience so quickly. But regardless of what Her Highness said, it was clear that she was still expecting what was happening now. As a result, the Marquise quickly asked for forgiveness and said she had to go, as she was in a hurry to travel. But the Crown Princess stopped the girl, saying that she had recently had a premonition for Helios that His Majesty would soon pass away, and then asked the protagonist if she had seen any other visions about this. She asked this question because last night His Majesty suddenly felt dizzy and fainted, but the saint was nearby and used her healing abilities. Then Hestia suddenly asked Her Highness if there was a problem with her superpower. Diana reacted very noticeably to this, repeating that she had no problems. After that, the Marquise said she had a vision that Diana's powers were weakening, and soon they would disappear completely without a trace. The saint began to argue with Hestia, saying that this ability was given to her by God, so the Marquise didn't understand what she was talking about at all. But the protagonist explained to Her Highness that she was simply conveying what she saw without embellishing anything, because her power was also given by God. Hestia told Diana that she didn't even know how to convey this information to the Crown Prince, but Her Highness began to say that she would tell everything herself, so she asked the Marquise to keep it a secret for now. Then the protagonist reassured the Crown Princess that if she didn't want to, then Hestia wouldn't tell Helios about this prophecy. As a result, the girl gave divine advice on how to keep the secret longer and then left, pondering how the main characters would overcome this crisis. Diana believed she was special, as she had been told this all her life, so she had no doubt that God would not abandon her. The next day, as planned, Callus and Hestia embarked on their journey together. But they weren't going for no reason. They were going to see the lands of Ilion, the place where important events of past years took place. The Marquis fell in love with the saint there, time and time again, so Hestia was very worried because they were going to a place filled with memories of Diana, which could cause pain for her beloved. Callus thought that the Marquis didn't like the place they were going, so much so that his wife started to get nervous about it. Ilion boasted fertile lands along a large river, and trade flourished there. The city was full of life, famous for its bustling streets and proximity to the imperial capital. Hestia echoed words Diana had spoken in the past, remarking how in this place it felt like people were truly living and working to their fullest. This startled Callus, who couldn't understand how his wife knew what the Crown Princess had said. It was then that the Marquise realized she had unknowingly spoken Diana's lines from the original story. The carriage jolted, causing Hestia's ribbon to wrinkle slightly. Callus immediately reached out to straighten it. Another stone rolled under the wheel, jostling them again, and they found themselves in a rather awkward position. Hestia felt embarrassed by their sudden proximity, while Callus, intrigued by her apparent ability to foresee even casual conversations, pressed her about the extent of her powers. He suspected she had already seen his past in this city. They arrived at a place Callus referred to as a recreational facility, a place where one could do anything they desired. He added that over 20 people could work there, and were ready to begin. Hestia was delighted to have such a suitable location on their estate, with convenient transportation and a large enough warehouse for materials. The Marquis asked if his wife had gathered all the soap makers. However, they had all declined, viewing soap making as an art form and finding the idea of mass production distasteful. Even Dukedom, who had assisted Hestia in her search, couldn't find anyone willing. Callus decided he would have to join the search, but Hestia tried to dissuade him, worried he might overdo it. He insisted, stating it was his duty as her husband to help. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a visitor to the workshop. It was the village head of Ilion, concerned about their absence and wondering if something had happened, as they hadn't arrived at their expected lodging. Callus noticed Hestia's friendly demeanor with the village head. The head inquired about their presence at the workshop, and Callus explained he wanted his wife to see the place she would be using. Since Hestia would be using the workshop, the village head offered to prepare all the necessary equipment. Hestia's sleepless nights had not been in vain. She had managed the estate affairs admirably, even overseeing the flawless repair of the riverbank. The riverbank had been destroyed by the flood that had brought the main characters together. Fortunately, the damage to Ilion had been minimal. Following their conversation, Callus reviewed the construction logs and accounting records. Callus was surprised to see that Hestia had handled everything herself, so he gave her the reports to review as well. He was impressed by her diligence and how quickly she learned. After reviewing the reports, Hestia gave the village head a series of instructions regarding the riverbank. Someone suggested she visit the riverbank itself to see the results of her hard work. Hestia declined, worried it held unpleasant memories for Callus, but he agreed to the walk. Callus explained he wanted to see the results of Hestia's efforts, as the area had always been picturesque. He also wanted to appear as a normal married couple. Callus offered his arm to Hestia, expressing his desire for them to go together. Hestia admitted that being reborn as Hestia felt like a dream, especially spending this day with her beloved. It felt surreal to walk hand in hand with Callus, while others kept their distance. Hestia knew this place held memories for him, and all she could do was wait, matching his slow pace. Callus acknowledged that Hestia likely knew he had walked here with Diana, as nothing could be hidden from her. Hestia replied that since she knew everything, he needn't pretend. As Hestia expected, Callus was lost in memories of Diana, a woman who had brought so much light into his life. He eventually noticed Hestia's discomfort, but she reassured him, grateful that Diana had given him the experience of precious love. But in Hestia's heart, she resented the crown princess because Diana always thought she knew best, but her path wasn't always the right one. Diana always saw life simply, so she advised Callus to try living simply too. Then the Marquise noticed her beloved was chuckling at her, which made Hestia very embarrassed. Due to Hestia's liveliness, her hair started to become disheveled, so Callus approached her and gently fixed it. Then he confessed to Hestia that he was very grateful for the many things she had done for him, so Callus thanked her for everything she had done. After saying his thanks, the Marquis started to get closer and closer to Hestia, making her blush from head to toe. It turned out that Callus had come so close to help his wife fix her hair and then tie it with a ribbon so that the wind wouldn't bother her anymore. But Hestia was also surprised to find that the Marquis used the hairpin she had left with him, meaning he had kept it all this time. Hestia felt ashamed because when her beloved started to approach, she hadn't thought at all that he was going to fix her hair. Meanwhile, the Marquis himself noticed that the renovated riverbank looked sturdy, and it was all thanks to Hestia submitting the correctly approved budget on time. Hestia was glad that her husband noticed all her efforts, because everything she did was for him. Callus didn't know how many times he needed to thank his wife, because she had done so much for him. Hestia listened to the Marquis as if she couldn't believe her ears, because she was very happy with Callus's words. Then she realized that she couldn't leave this novel, only because Hestia's reason for being in it was her beloved Callus, whom she helped in every way. As Hestia pondered the meaning of existence, the Marquis suggested that they should go home. The Marquise understood that she should be the one thanking her husband, not the other way around, because he had brought meaning to her life. With that thought, Hestia followed her beloved. He made her very happy. Hestia understood that for her, the protagonist of this novel was only Callus, and everyone else was just meaningless text. A few days later, the Marquis was asked about the trip because rumors about Callus and his wife going to Aeolian had likely spread. But this question came as a surprise to Hestia, so she asked Lady Harmony how she knew about it, and then Hestia discovered that high society people only talked about them as a couple. The Marquise was surprised that the rumors spread so quickly, even though the trip had just happened. At that moment, Hestia realized that Lady Harmony was very curious about the story of her and Callus's outing, so she began to tell it. Hestia had to explain to Lady Harmony that she and her husband hadn't gone on a date, but just to see the workshop and, by the way, to inspect their property. Then Lady Harmony remembered that Dukedom was looking for soap makers for the Marquise, because Hestia planned to open a soap factory of her own production. But the problem was that all the artisans were very stubborn, and it was difficult to persuade them to mass produce. This fact made Hestia very frustrated, because without skilled workers, her plans could not become a reality, but only a pipe dream. Lady Harmony felt sorry for Hestia and immediately offered to help her find workers. But the Marquise refused, explaining that everything was fine and she no longer needed help, all because Callus had already started helping her and, as if by magic, quickly found 2 artisans who also decided to bring their apprentices. Furthermore, when the mass production method for soap was fully established, it would be best to hire slum dwellers and pay them an allowance. When the artisans and apprentices finished the technical development, everything in the workshop would go smoothly, and those poor people would be able to get jobs. Lady Harmony was surprised that the Marquis himself had solved such a problem so easily. Callus must have cherished his wife very much to help her so much and even go to Aeolian with her. The soap factory was currently progressing well, all thanks to the Marquis. Although Hestia had made so much noise at Diana's tea party, Harmony, who was close to the saint, still sent Hestia a letter about the temple. As Hestia was deep in thought, Lady Harmony was glad that everything was going well with the soap factory. The Marquise thought that Harmony's relationship with Her Majesty the Empress might have changed, so she decided to find out at all costs. Afterwards, Hestia thanked Lady Harmony for the letter, which warned about the temple's condemnation, and then apologized for not replying, as she had been very busy. Hestia asked Harmony if anything she didn't know about it happened during the time they hadn't been in touch. As it turned out, the reason Lady Harmony wanted to see Hestia was the Crown Princess. Then Hestia asked what had happened to Diana, since Harmony had come to her. Lady Harmony admitted that, aside from you, Marquise, she wouldn't tell this to anyone, but the Crown Princess is still not used to royal life, and Diana's overly straightforward personality is hindering this. Coming from Lady Harmony, who always stands by the saint's side and defends her everywhere, these words are truly unexpected. So something truly terrible must have happened. And the reason Lady Harmony said this is because of the rumor that Lady Mellop has decided to leave the Imperial Palace. She is practically the guardian of the palace, yet she decided to leave her home, which shocked Hestia. Although His Majesty the Emperor and His Highness the Crown Prince immediately stopped Lady Mellop, her resolve remained firm. Therefore, Lady Harmony began to think that all of this happened precisely because of Crown Princess Diana. The Marquise agreed, recalling that at Crown Princess Diana's tea party, she indeed couldn't feel Lady Mellop's presence, so perhaps she and the Crown Princess had a falling out. Lady Harmony also thought so, as all of this couldn't be a mere coincidence. Lady Mellop must have felt that she could no longer handle the Crown Princess, and due to her advanced age, she might also be mentally exhausted. Although Hestia wanted to ruin Crown Princess Diana's reputation, it turned out that the saint herself was doing a much better job at it. The Crown Princess should be advised to weigh things more carefully, as Lady Mellop's role is becoming increasingly important due to the current situation. Lady Harmony couldn't be at peace because she had always been a supporter of the Crown Princess. In all matters, Lady Harmony's changed attitude towards the Crown Princess was evident, which was unusual for such a kind protagonist like Harmony. Even those who had always been kind to the saint were beginning to question her actions. This was one of Hestia's small victories. Precisely because of the Crown Princess's behavior, Lady Harmony had a request for the Marquise. Lady Harmony herself had given up on Crown Princess Diana and turned to Hestia for help, so the girl was surprised by what happened. Hestia was already imagining Lady Harmony asking her for something like help leaving the Crown Princess, but the protagonist's fantasy did not come true, as Lady Harmony, instead of giving up on the saint, asked Hestia to speak directly with Crown Princess Diana. The girl was already starting to think that this was just her imagination, as she was expecting something completely different. Hestia even had to ask again if she really needed to do this, and if it was really with the Crown Princess. Crown Princess Diana. Lady Harmony's request was for the Marquise to talk to the Saint, which didn't align at all with the protagonist's recent thoughts. However, Hestia recalled that, due to the incident at the tea party, the Crown Princess had distanced herself from her, as the Crown Princess had been deeply offended by the protagonist at that tea party. But Lady Harmony began to persuade the Marquise that one mistake didn't mean Callus's wife could no longer care for the Saint. After all, in Lady Harmony's opinion, only this girl could influence the Crown Princess, and was even the only one who dared to speak directly to Crown Princess Diana. This information was so unexpected for Hestia that it took her a minute to comprehend and process it. Lady Harmony understood that such a sudden request caused difficulties for the Marquise, as it was all too unexpected. But Harmony could no longer remain silent, as the Crown Princess had recently become somewhat sharp, things that she would have calmly dealt with in the past. Crown Princess Diana now perceived sharply and emotionally. Lady Harmony herself tried to talk to the Crown Princess, but the girl wouldn't listen at all. Crown Princess Diana couldn't go on like this, because at this rate, the Saint would soon lose her authority. Therefore, the person the Crown Princess needed most now was Hestia, because in Lady Harmony's opinion, it was she who had earned the Crown Princess's trust. The Marquise herself concluded that Lady Harmony must be crazy to say such unbelievable things. Meanwhile, Lady Harmony continued to look at the girl hopefully. She didn't understand why she had to say anything to the Crown Princess. It was likely that Harmony's confidence in Hestia stemmed from the tea party, as that was when the protagonist showed she could speak her mind in front of Crown Princess Diana without fear. But on the other hand, it turned out that Crown Princess Diana's situation was very bad. She wouldn't even listen to Lady Harmony. If one thought about it this way, then it was His Majesty the Emperor and Crown Prince Helios who said they wouldn't allow Lady Melop to leave the Imperial Palace. This meant that, in this situation, Crown Princess Diana didn't seem to be at odds with her husband. Judging by the fact that the Crown Prince hadn't summoned Hestia yet, he was still unaware of what was happening with his wife's divine power. After carefully considering the whole situation, the Marquise began to devise another brilliant plan to deal with all this information. Then the protagonist told Harmony that she couldn't resist such a sincere request, after which Lady Harmony promised that she would, in turn, help Hestia when she needed it. It would be difficult to refuse Lady Harmony's request. Since she is in charge of Crown Princess Diana's education, you need to maintain a good relationship with her. More importantly, if you fulfill this request, Lady Harmony will owe you a favor. But Hestia's only thought was that she wouldn't help Diana even if her life depended on it. Meanwhile, Lady Harmony was thinking about how kind the Marquise was. At the same time, Crown Prince Helios was alone in the Lily Garden, absent-minded and lost in thought. Helios still couldn't believe that Lady Melop, who had been by his side since childhood, was truly leaving after all these years. Lady Melop had taken the place of his deceased mother and cared for him until he became an adult. To the Crown Prince, Lady Melop was more than just a servant. She was like family. Therefore, Helios rushed into her room and asked if she was really leaving. The Crown Prince found the palace official packing all her belongings into a suitcase. Then, Lady Melop said she prayed to God every day that His Highness would become a benevolent monarch, so that even without her by his side, God would look after him. Helios asked Lady Melop if Diana was the reason for her sudden departure. To this, Lady Melop replied that she was simply tired of everything she had missed. The Crown Prince noticed how loyal she was, as she didn't proclaim that his wife was the reason for her leaving. The old-fashioned noblewomen had always been a thorn in the side of Diana's assertive and extravagant ways, so the Crown Princess always argued with Lady Melop. This was why the Crown Princess held that tea party as a way to promote her beliefs. However, since Diana was the central figure in the royal family responsible for entertaining influential nobles, Lady Melop could not allow her dignity to be insulted under any circumstances. The Crown Prince understood that even if Lady Melop didn't say anything, everyone knew Diana was the reason for her departure. Like Lady Harmony, Helios also began to notice the changes in his wife, as she no longer even tended the garden he was now strolling through, even though she used to dedicate a lot of time to it, saying that seeing the beautiful flowers brought her inner peace. In those days, the saint had told Helios that he often worried, so it would be good if he could also find peace from looking at the flowers. Back then, the two were getting along well, and Helios asked Diana what he should do if his mood didn't improve after looking at the flowers. The crown prince remembered the saint telling him that if that were the case, she would appear behind him. And in reality, at that very moment, Hestia called out to him. Since Helios didn't see the caller's face clearly, he initially thought it was his wife. For a moment, the crown prince even thought he saw his beloved calling him. However, it wasn't Diana at all, but Hestia, who was continuing to try and get his attention. The crown prince was still lost in his thoughts, while the woman continued to call, even beginning to worry if something had happened. Meanwhile, Helios was still thinking about Diana and how she said she would comfort him. It was then that the crown prince finally realized that the marquise had been standing in front of him the whole time. Hestia was surprised by the crown prince's reaction upon seeing her, and even began to feel that this trip was unnecessary. What a waste of effort. Their voices were completely different, and Helios concluded he must be crazy to have confused them. Finally, the crown prince collected his thoughts and asked the marquise what she was doing there if she wasn't looking for Diana. The reason being, despite receiving Lady Harmony's request, Hestia had no intention of seeing or speaking with the crown princess. Hestia came to the Imperial Palace only because she wanted to talk to Helios alone, although she hadn't expected to meet him in the garden on her way to his office. Something was clearly written all over the crown prince's face, and Hestia realized it was either related to Lady Mellop or His Majesty the Emperor's health. It was fortunate for the crown prince to run into Hestia, as he just happened to have a question for her. The marquise thought it was probably related to the crown princess's divine power. But unexpectedly, the crown prince asked if Marquis Callus had finally set off to inspect his territory. When the marquise said that she and her husband had decided to go together, Helios was happy to hear about his friend's improved health. But Hestia immediately shattered the crown prince's pleasant illusion, saying that a doctor was accompanying them, meaning the situation was still not optimistic. Hestia was indignant that Helios didn't care about Callus's condition when he was enjoying himself with Diana, only remembering to express concern when he was alone. But after meeting with the crown prince, Hestia clearly realized that the saint was hiding her secret and hadn't told her husband. Then Hestia began to wonder how long the crown princess would conceal the prophecy about her divine power. Despite the fact that the crown princess was thinking about something completely different at the time, Hestia was grateful that Helios was so worried about her husband. Then she added that the crown prince seemed different today, as he appeared distraught and exhausted. But this was understandable, as Helios was probably very worried about His Majesty the Emperor's health. When the crown prince asked what the lady was talking about, she explained that his wife had told her everything that had happened to His Majesty. Although the crown princess immediately used her divine power, her husband still looked pale and anxious. Hestia was the first to know what was going to happen, so there was no point in hiding anything from her. Then Helios said that although his father had received Diana's divine power, he was still having difficulty moving, meaning His Majesty had not yet fully recovered. Hestia said she knew it would be like this, which greatly surprised the crown prince, as he didn't understand what she meant by saying she knew. The marquise feigned surprise and asked His Highness if his wife really hadn't told him anything. But Helios only asked what this had to do with his wife. Then the marquise added fuel to the fire by saying that, judging by the crown prince's words, his wife hadn't told him anything yet. If so, then Hestia's prediction had come true. The lady said that in that case, she would no longer bother His Highness. Following this, the marquise only heard Helios demanding how she dared to trifle with the crown prince's duties. Finally, Hestia only added that the crown princess would confess everything to her husband sooner or later. Hestia admitted to the crown prince that she was worried that Diana hadn't mentioned such an important event and had also remained silent about the issues between the saint and Lady Mellop. And it was now unclear who was the most authoritative person in the palace, because even though His Majesty the Emperor and his son had persuaded Lady Mellop to stay, she had left because of the crown princess. His Highness ordered the marquise to stop speaking, as he could no longer tolerate such nonsense. Then Hestia said that Helios had made too many mistakes, and therefore she was very sorry. The marquise would not speak so carelessly, so the crown prince began to wonder what exactly Diana had to tell him. Nothing in the Saint's behavior betrayed that she was hiding something, as she behaved as usual, always greeting her husband with a smile. The Crown Princess was about to pour her beloved the tea she had just brewed, but Helios stopped her, as he had a request for her. The request was for Diana to also use her power to heal His Majesty the Emperor, as he had not yet fully recovered. For Saint, this seemed like a simple action, as you only need to heal one person, but it was clear how worried she began to feel about this. But the girl quickly put on a calm mask, saying that Helios's tone had frightened her, and then the Saint promised that she would definitely visit her husband's father again at noon in order to help him with her power. The Crown Prince apologized to his wife for disturbing her, as she probably had a lot to do, but Diana reassured him that she wanted to do this herself. However, the Crown Prince wondered if this was too much, as his wife had already used her divine power on His Majesty sooner or later. Then Diana said that if she lost her power, then she would worry, but now everything was fine, and the Crown Prince shouldn't doubt the divine power. The Crown Princess assured him that His Majesty the Emperor would recover soon, so there was no need to worry about anything. Helios wanted to say something else to his wife, but didn't manage to, as he was interrupted by an unexpected knock on the door. A maid interrupted the couple's conversation, informing them that the high priests were waiting in the living room. Then Diana went to her long-scheduled meeting with them, and therefore she couldn't continue the conversation with her husband. As the maid escorted the Crown Princess to the high priests, she noticed that the Crown Princess was hurrying as if she were being chased. Diana was in such a hurry because she was very frightened by the conversation about her power, and therefore she tried to escape as quickly as possible. The Saint began to worry that Hestia might have already told her husband everything, as Helios spoke as if he already knew something. For a moment, the Crown Princess thought about going back and talking honestly with Hestia about everything, but then she decided that the time wasn't right. As Diana pondered the whole situation, the servant noticed something was wrong with her and tried to understand what had happened. But Diana's thoughts were completely occupied by the fact that, although her power had not yet completely disappeared. However, when this happened, the secret could no longer be hidden. At that moment, not only was the Crown Princess pondering the situation, but also her husband, left alone, was lost in his own thoughts. The man couldn't understand why the people he trusted were leaving. The Emperor's health was deteriorating, and his beloved wife had become suspicious. At first, he thought it was all because of Hestia, but he quickly dismissed that thought because it was his own problem, his failure to handle his affairs. His Highness the Crown Prince wasn't used to solving problems alone, as Callus had always been by his side, assisting him in everything. So, His Highness decided that he urgently needed to meet with the Marquis, as the Marquis always found a way out of difficult situations. Meanwhile, Hestia was pleased that after the tea party, Countess Irenaeus had finally invited Diana to her place. She even wrote a letter thanking the Marquise for facilitating the Countess's friendship with Diana. But Countess Irenaeus' pride was hurt because Her Highness the Crown Princess didn't easily open her heart to ordinary flattery or gifts. So the Countess learned about Lady Melop's news a little late, even later than Lady Harmony. The Marquise understood that Countess Irenaeus was not a friend to her, but a political ally. The Countess asked Diana for advice, and she suggested first examining Diana's environment and trying to change it. Then Hestia remembered the Crown Prince, surprised that she hadn't received any news from him, meaning that the main characters might have already resolved all the issues. But even so, the Marquise should have been summoned to the palace. As soon as the young lady thought about His Highness, she unexpectedly encountered him along with her beloved. The Marquise found herself in a secluded mansion in the Imperial capital, the location of the Crown Prince's secret villa in the original novel. It was a historic place where the main character's relationship truly began to develop after Helios revealed this place to Diana. Hestia couldn't understand why she had come to this particular villa, and with the two most important handsome men from the novel, the Crown Prince told Callus that they needed to leave to talk. After the Marquise said that if something happened to her husband, he should call her immediately, he was very surprised to be considered so dangerous. But Hestia's anxiety was justified, because the last time Helios was alone with Marquis Callus, Callus was injured. As it turned out, the reason the young lady ended up in this place was because the Crown Prince wanted to meet somewhere. And since this was a formal order from His Highness to the Marquis, Callus couldn't simply ignore it. Hestia was angry that the Crown Prince had ordered her husband to meet because he was afraid that Callus would refuse an ordinary meeting. Since the female protagonist had recently seen Helios, perhaps she knew the reason he wanted to meet. Then the female protagonist explained that the Crown Prince was in a state of exhaustion. The female protagonist was angry with His Highness because when Callus was in a difficult situation, Helios didn't even show up, but when he himself had problems, he immediately wanted to see Callus. But Hestia's anger was so endearing that it calmed Callus down. Hestia wasn't going to let her beloved go alone, so she expressed her desire to go with him. Although the female protagonist was glad that the meeting place wasn't the Imperial Palace, she was still angry that the Crown Prince had chosen this particular place, even though he had the money to go to other secret locations. The young lady's anxiety was so obvious that even Marquis Macarius, the physician, noticed it and began to comfort Hestia, saying that Callus would definitely be all right. And although His Highness and the Marquis's conversation dragged on for a long time, this indicated that Hestia's husband was feeling much better. The physician pointed out that if the Marquis continued like this, then it would no longer be her husband who needed treatment, but the female protagonist herself. Just as Callus's wife was starting to think that her beloved had been gone too long, he immediately emerged. But unfortunately, he didn't return in good condition, as he was pale and barely able to stand. Meanwhile, the Crown Prince left directly, without even saying goodbye to the man he once considered his closest friend. The physician immediately offered the man medicine to relieve his tension, but Callus pushed away the hand holding the pills. While the female protagonist was still pondering what had happened to her beloved, he asked to clarify whether Hestia had really asked Helios for Attica, Duke Oak's territory. It turned out that Helios had told the Marquis that the girl had asked for these lands and the ducal title for Callus in exchange for a prophecy. Hestia understood that her husband was now confused because she hadn't told the Marquis such important information. Callus directly asked his wife if she wanted the Duchess title, and if not, whether she was connected to Duchess Latona. A few hours ago, the Crown Prince and the Marquis had a conversation, during which Helios apologized for summoning his friend to the meeting by order, as he was simply afraid that they wouldn't want to see him. Then Callus asked what he had been called for, addressing Helios as Your Highness, which surprised His Highness with its formality. Since even the Marquis had distanced himself so much from the Crown Prince, the man no longer had anyone he could trust. Then Callus stated that trusting someone is actually a decision one makes by their own will. Then His Highness wondered if he could trust Crown Princess Diana now, as she was acting as if she was hiding something. Since Helios had no more questions for Callus, the Marquis hurried to leave the Crown Prince, because his wife was waiting for him. The Crown Prince then noticed that his friend seemed to truly trust Hestia, even knowing what the girl had asked for in exchange for the prophecy. When His Highness learned that the Marquise hadn't told her husband about this matter, he said that the heroine had requested that Callus be made a duke, the owner of the Attica territory, where the deceased Duke Oakes had once ruled. This information was incomprehensible to Callus, as Hestia didn't seem greedy to him. He was sure that she didn't need wealth, as she herself often repeated that she wasn't interested in possessions and finances. Callus decided that he shouldn't trust his wife, as she might simply be deceiving him. This is why he went to the heroine, deeply upset. Then the Marquise started to worry that she had driven her beloved to such a state. She began to panic so much that the physician decided to leave the couple alone. Hestia decided to resolve this misunderstanding as soon as possible. So she began to explain that she had no connection to the deceased Duchess, and that she did all this to make the Crown Prince and his wife apologize to her husband. The territory of Attica and the Duke's title were simply necessary to fulfill her plan. The girl had no hidden agenda. Callus asked why he should believe someone who had already concealed important information from him. Without an oath, anyone could say such things, so Hestia decided she could swear an oath that her beloved would believe. Then the Marquise began to tell Callus that she wanted him to become an indispensable pillar of this empire, so that his life would become great, because without her husband, the country would not be able to get back on its feet. Also wants the main couple to bow their heads before the Marquis, and she will arrange everything for this. The Marquis's reaction to his wife's vow was that he simply pulled his hand out of her hands and then told them to go home already. Because of her excitement, Hestia remained in place, and Cale began to leave alone, which attracted the attention of the doctor, who noticed that for some reason the Marquis had blushed a little, and then the man wondered if he could trust his wife, and he remembered the words about trust that he himself had recently spoken to the prince. After that day, Cale did not kick Hestia out of his residence, but he did not speak to the girl again. So the heroine lived under the same roof with her beloved, but without seeing him. Then finally, samples of soap made by artisans arrived, and Hestia decided to dare to go to her husband to find out his opinion about the soap. But the girl didn't even have time to knock on the door of Cale's office before he opened the door, colliding with the heroine. Then the Marquis asked what Hestia was doing under his door, and she explained everything by saying that she just wanted to take a walk, which did not sound convincing at all. And in the end, the heroine said that samples of soap had arrived and she wanted to show them to her lover. Cale invited the girl to his office and then noticed that the soap samples were received quite quickly. Meanwhile, Hestia tried to understand the mood of her husband, noting that he had not gotten worse, and it seemed that he was not even avoiding the heroine. There were several samples of soap, and they were all different, so the heroine asked Cale to choose the best. Among the samples were soaps without fragrance, somewhat hard, slightly soft, and colored. In the end, the Marquis decided that the soap should be hard and with a fragrance. Until now, soap was the exclusive property of the nobility, and commoners who admire the nobles will surely want something similar. The heroine thanked Kyle for the good advice, and then said that she would immediately send the answer to the masters. Then the Marquis thought whether the common people would use soap correctly because they had never used it and therefore would not be able to immediately get used to washing with it. So they had to come up with something to help them. After some time, Helena and Pomux appeared at the Marquis' residence, who are excellent actors whose beauty cannot be described in words. But in addition to their appearance, they are comprehensively developed and stage their own plays. People in this novel think that illnesses are God's wrath or punishment. Even if they start using soap, it will not change their worldview. Therefore, Hestia decided to create an advertisement with the help of actors to persuade the common people to use soap. The Marquis summoned the most popular actors and explained her idea to them, that they could set an example for the public and get everyone to start using soap. However, the actors said they couldn't accept sponsorship under such conditions proposed by the Marquis, as the script for Ilion had already been written, rehearsed, and planned. In this situation, adding new content and modifying the script and direction at the last minute was unreasonable. Hestia realized she had approached the actors too late and told them they could respond to the proposal later. The Marquis explained her thinking to them. Because many food or clothing trends arose precisely because of plays, the use of soap could also become popular because of this. Thanks to the advertisement, the money Callus gave was exactly the amount offered to the actors in the contract. But Hestia herself wasn't sure if this amount was appropriate, as she knew nothing about the prices of advertisements in the novel. Moreover, standing before the young woman were the actors currently enjoying the best reputation in the Empire. As soon as the actors saw the contract stating the amount, they immediately changed their minds, agreed to the advertisement, and thanked the Marquis. Hestia was still thinking about whether she had overestimated the actors by giving them so much money, while Callus himself was thinking that perhaps he should have given more. Thanks to this inflated amount, Callus, Helena, and Pollux enthusiastically promoted soap, coming up with many slogans that could pique the interest of ordinary people. Due to the soap factory, the Marquis faced more work, which took up almost all of her time, so now the young woman was very tired every day. Hestia was glad that at least there were no lessons with Lady Harmony and no important social events, as the Marquis now had absolutely no time to deal with them. Remembering social events, the Marquis wondered how Countess Irenaeus was progressing in persuading the young ladies around Diana. Then she thought that Helios would soon want to see the Marquis. As the Marquis expected, shortly after she thought about it, His Highness actually summoned her. His Highness, without even greeting Hestia, told her that due to her conflict with Diana and open hostility towards the Crown Prince, he didn't trust her. But despite the Marquis's actions, all her predictions were extremely accurate, and these predictions concerned extremely important issues that could determine the fate of the Empire. While signing some document, Helios added that the Marquis forced him to acknowledge that the Empire needed her abilities. All this led His Highness to demand that Hestia tell him everything the Marquise had discussed with Diana, as he was still distressed that his wife had hidden something from him. He then added that the young woman was obliged to tell him everything, as it was His Highness's order, which could not be disobeyed. Although the Marquise had promised His Highness to keep everything secret, she was ready to break this promise at any moment. So she began to tell the Crown Prince that she had conveyed a promise to his wife. Of course, Hestia emphasized that Diana had said she would tell her husband everything herself and ordered the Marquise to remain silent. Thus, the Crown Prince learned of the Marquise's prediction that within the next 2 years, the Crown Princess's healing abilities would completely disappear. In the original story, the source of Diana's healing abilities was mentioned only once, as if in passing, saying that the saint, who had witnessed the miserable lives of the poor since childhood, prayed devoutly to God, and God heard her prayers and granted her power. The novel didn't give a reason why Diana was given this ability, most likely simply because she was the protagonist. Then the Crown Prince realized that the Emperor's condition would not improve, meaning that all the talk about His Majesty's recovery was a lie. The Marquise asked Helios what he intended to do next, and he replied that he would simply wait for the time being. The Crown Prince told Hestia that the next time she had a premonition, the Marquise must report everything to Helios first. The Marquise understood that in the world of the novel, the only thing she could possibly lose in 2 years was her life, not the ability she never had. Meanwhile, at Hestia's home, Euros brought her husband a letter written to the Marquis and Marquise by the theater actors sponsored by the Marquise. Since the Marquise was at the palace at the time, Callus decided to read it himself first to see what had happened. In this letter, Helena and Pollux wrote that they were very grateful for the donation, as now they could create plays of unparalleled perfection. As a token of their gratitude, the actors left 2 tickets for the best seats for Hestia and Callus, as they hoped the couple would come to see their performance. Sifting through performances, in case the female lead had free time, they could go to the theater together. For the rest of the day, Hestia's thoughts were occupied with the idea of going somewhere with her beloved. They had even begun designing a dress for her, but Hestia was only worried that going to the theater together would be like a date. As soon as the couple appeared at the theater, Helena and Pollux happily greeted them, thanking them for taking the time. Decima had even designed matching outfits for Hestia and Callus, so going to the theater felt even more like a date. Then Helena pulled the Marquise aside, saying that some nobles were attending the play, so both the performance and the advertisement had to be successful. After that, the actors wished the couple a pleasant viewing and hurried to the stage. The Marquise realized she wasn't here for a date, but for work, so she stopped worrying and felt much calmer and more confident. Callus noticed the girl's nervousness suddenly dissipate and remarked that, come to think of it, this was his and Hestia's first outing together as a married couple. The Marquis took his wife's hand in his, and together they went to watch the play. Hestia was so surprised by this that all words escaped her, leaving only unconcealed emotion. Because of the girl's embarrassment, Callus couldn't take his eyes off her, but Hestia herself couldn't understand why her beloved seemed to be laughing at her. The actors did incorporate an advertisement into the play, where Helena's character talked about how the soap made her smell like a noble. The effects of the soap were slightly exaggerated in the advertisement, which Callus commented on, but Hestia explained to him that such an advertisement was sure to work. The play itself was a simple story about a commoner girl who deceived everyone, pretending to be a noble lady. As a result, the protagonist began to live in a false world with a false identity, which reminded Hestia of herself. After all, the Marquise in this world had become a minor fictional character, not herself, and everything about her current situation wasn't real. Hestia was so saddened by her thoughts that even Callus noticed her change in mood. The girl understood that, just like the protagonist of the play, she couldn't let her lies be exposed because all of this was for her beloved. In the play, the protagonist had a happy ending because someone loved her, but if the Marquise's deception was revealed, then she would have nothing left in the world of the novel. When the play ended and people began to leave, they encountered vendors loudly hawking the soap used by the protagonist at a discount. Of course, Hestia's plan worked, and everyone immediately rushed to buy the soap, as it had such a wonderful scent, and the product was also very cheap. Selling soap after a successful play was a good idea, because while the impression of the performance was still fresh, the product would sell even better. If word of mouth was this good, then tomorrow everyone would know that soap was available at the department store. Callus, noticing how happy Hestia was, asked her if the play was interesting, and then the girl realized that the Marquis himself wasn't too happy with some parts of the performance. But before the man could finish his thought, he was interrupted by Helena and Pollux running towards them. Helena began to say that this was the best public response the actors had ever received, and it was all thanks to the Marquis and Marquise who had supported and sponsored the play. Not only Helena and Pollux came to thank Callus and Hestia, as others followed the actors and also came to thank the couple, including for the soap. Because there were so many people, Hestia began to worry about Callus's condition, but turning around, she saw him just standing aside, not worried at all because in his opinion, it was fair as he hadn't done anything anyway. While Hestia listened to all the thanks directed at her, the Marquis simply admired her from afar, lost in his own thoughts. Everyone asked Hestia if the play was interesting, to which she replied yes, while her husband simultaneously thought that it was all a lie. After all, Callus noticed that his wife hadn't shown any reaction throughout the entire play. Throughout the entire performance, Hestia remained indifferent to everything, as if it had nothing to do with her. It was during this play that Callus saw such an expression on Hestia's face for the first time. The Marquis understood that he had chosen to trust his wife. However, he also understood that the girl was still hiding a lot from him. The man began to wonder if he would ever live to see the moment when Hestia would trust him and tell him everything herself. After the event, Hestia felt utterly exhausted from socializing with so many people. The Marquise thought how lucky her beloved was to have slipped away early, while she herself was left utterly drained by the throng of guests. Callus noticed the weariness etched on her face all day. Hestia explained it away as overwork, assuring him that after some rest, she would be fine. Even at the cafe, however, she couldn't fully relax. At a nearby table sat several nobles who had also attended the play, loudly discussing Pollux. But then, the noble women's conversation shifted to the Crown Prince's frequent absences on official business. They speculated that something must be wrong with His Majesty, most likely a health issue. The ladies expressed their surprise, wondering how that could be, with the Saint, the Crown Princess, residing in the Imperial Palace. Although considerable time had passed since the Emperor's illness, the rumors had spread slowly. Even so, whispers about Diana's waning divine power would soon circulate. Hestia then overheard gossip that the Crown Prince was growing tired of conversing with his wife, a tidbit Countess Irenaeus had shared. Countess Irenaeus told everyone that Diana continued to impose her beliefs on others. While this was good news for Hestia's plan, she worried about how Callus would react to hearing such things. But then, the Marquis admitted that, in his opinion, the temple's teachings weren't as virtuous as the Crown Princess believed. This startled Hestia. Callus's negative assessment of Diana was unexpected. Callus then informed his wife that he had to see the Emperor. Hestia tried to understand why her beloved needed to meet with the Emperor, as she herself was completely baffled by his sudden decision. Nothing in their current situation hinted at such a declaration. He added that he had rested long enough and it was time to return to work. Hestia opposed this idea. In her view, Callus hadn't fully recovered, and there was no need to rush back. Moreover, due to the Emperor's health, the Saint would constantly be by his side. If Callus went to see the Emperor, he would inevitably encounter the Crown Princess. If the Marquis saw Diana, his condition might worsen, just as it had started to improve. Callus reassured his wife, saying the Crown Princess no longer mattered to him. He then added that he hadn't said he would go alone. This surprised Hestia, prompting her to ask who he intended to take with him. To her astonishment, Callus gestured towards her, implying that it was his wife who would accompany him. And so, the couple went to see the Emperor. His Majesty was delighted that Callus, the child he considered his own, had brought his wife to meet him. Upon returning from the cafe, the Marquis immediately requested an audience with the Emperor to discuss his return to work. The Emperor had likely anticipated this and quickly set a date for the audience. The couple eventually entered the palace together. Callus greeted His Majesty and then introduced his wife, Hestia. Since His Majesty treated Marquis Callus like a son, Callus felt it was appropriate to formally introduce his wife. Meanwhile, Marquise Hestia was surprised. Her husband was there, and so was Diana, whom she had expected to meet. Although Hestia and Callus remained silent before the Emperor for a moment, Hestia is still worried about Callus and Diana being in the same room. However, Looking at Callus, she began to feel that everything would be all right. Her beloved was recovering and even ready to return to work. The Emperor was surprised to discover that Hestia was not only the Marquis's wife, but also his assistant in various matters. He had heard of the Marquis's acclaim in Ilion and praised her versatility. Hestia modestly dismissed it as exaggerated rumors. Crown Prince Helios then interjected that even if they started as exaggerations, over time, they would escalate and become reality. Hestia had intended to remain composed, but with Helios speaking, she could no longer easily ignore these two key figures. Crown Prince Helios then pointed out that not long ago, the Marquis required a physician to accompany him everywhere. Yet now he suddenly wished to resume his duties, despite the uncertainty of his recovery. Helios surmised that Hestia had influenced the Marquis, prompting his sudden desire to return to work. As Crown Princess Diana was about to scold Hestia, Callus stopped her. He calmly explained that, on the contrary, his wife was against his returning to work so soon, worried about his health. Despite the Marquis's attempts to dissuade him, he had reassured her he was perfectly fine. Hestia was stunned by Callus's words. He was taking her side in front of Crown Princess Diana, the woman he had loved deeply for so long. Hestia wasn't sure what expression to wear to appear natural and unaffected. Since the topic of health had been raised, Callus decided to inquire about the Emperor's well-being, having heard rumors of his recent ill health. He explained that he hadn't initially believed the gossip, but seeing the Emperor's pale complexion today, he had grown concerned. The Marquis then questioned why Crown Princess Diana couldn't use her divine powers to heal the Emperor. The Saint began to timidly explain her abilities, but the Emperor cut her short, assuring everyone there was no need for concern. After all, His Majesty was getting on in years. It was only natural. However, the Emperor stated he was in much better condition than he appeared. The rumors had sprung up due to Crown Prince Helios attending cabinet meetings in his stead, which was simply to give Helios more experience. Callus replied that it seemed his worries were unfounded, as the Emperor appeared to be in good health, especially with the Saint possessing healing powers by his side. The Marquis's insistence on the Emperor's health and the Saint's abilities was a veiled warning to the Crown Prince and Princess. He knew their secret. Despite Crown Princess Diana using her divine powers on the Emperor, his poor complexion remained evident, a clear indication of his illness. It was surprising that Callus dared to bring up both the Emperor's health and the Saint's powers. This implied a complete severing of ties between the Marquis and the Crown Prince. Hestia's husband was simply issuing a warning. Now, having received this warning, Helios and his wife had to consider their next move. They could either attempt to forge a friendship with the Marquis and Marquise, or consider them enemies. Hestia realized this was the perfect moment to put the next stage of her plan into action, and turned to the Emperor with a suggestion. As she began to speak, the Crown Prince immediately guessed the Marquise's intentions and tried to stop her, but failed. Hestia's proposal concerned the ennoblement of her beloved husband, the Duke. After the meeting, once they were in their carriage, Callus asked his wife how she could have brought up the dukedom. She explained she couldn't trust the Crown Prince, so she appealed directly to the Emperor. One always needed a backup plan. Callus then clutched his head, worrying his wife. She immediately asked how he felt. He explained he was simply tired and wanted to sleep. Hestia suggested he rest while they traveled, promising to wake him upon arrival. During the meeting, everyone had been taken aback when Hestia mentioned the dukedom. It was completely unexpected. Crown Princess Diana, however, was the most shocked, declaring Hestia's request incredibly audacious. The Marquise refused to back down. She explained that, considering the atrocities committed by the House of Ochus, it was best to elevate someone demonstrably loyal to the Emperor, preventing a repeat of the past. Helios tried to silence her, insisting it wasn't the right time. Judging by his tone, the Emperor was indeed taken aback by Hestia's proposal. Although the Crown Prince had promised the former Ochus dukedom to the former Marquis, Hestia didn't trust him. Her primary concern was the Emperor's response. The Emperor then remarked on what a prize Callus had in his wife, admitting he'd learned a great deal about the Marquis from his son and daughter-in-law after his last meeting with Callus. The Emperor fully understood Hestia's thinking and proposed discussing the idea further with the Crown Prince. He asserted that having Hestia as an aide would improve matters considerably. Hestia was overjoyed. Helios could fume all he wanted. His father was praising the Marquis and showing no signs of stopping. Neither Helios nor Crown Princess Diana spoke further. Emperor. The Marquis and his wife continued conversing with the Emperor. As Hestia mentally replayed the entire meeting, she didn't even notice Callus had fallen asleep. Hestia found the scene endearing, even regretting the lack of a smartphone in this world to capture the moment. Later, she would recall how nobly her beloved had defended her. Before Crown Prince Helios, the Emperor lay in bed, his son attending to him. The Emperor confessed to Helios that attending the meeting had been a strain. The Emperor, aware of Callus's sharp observation skills, knew the Marquis had merely feigned ignorance. Helios informed his father that Diana would soon arrive to heal him, but the Emperor instructed his son to tell his wife to refrain from such exertions in the future. The Emperor added that he and his son needed to discuss Diana's powers. Having observed her daily efforts to heal him, the Emperor had noticed a change in her divine power. Helios then sought out his beloved. She was preparing to heal the Emperor and inquired about his well-being. She then began a conversation, expressing her surprise at the Marquis's suggestion of a dukedom. While the Emperor spoke, her husband had remained silent, as if gathering his thoughts to say something important. Before seeking out Diana, Helios had spoken with his father about her. The Emperor had noticed his daughter-in-law's recent anxiety. He had also observed a change in her divine power and advised Helios to spend more time with her. After speaking with his father, Helios himself had paled, prompting Diana to ask if he, too, needed healing after visiting the Emperor. Meanwhile, Helios thought to himself that his wife, unable to even heal the Emperor, had offered to use her powers on him. While the Emperor worried that his wife was hiding the change in her powers from him, Diana believed he was merely overly concerned about the Marquis. Helios realized he was tired of the entire situation. He and Diana were newlyweds, and this should have been the happiest time of their lives. Yet they did nothing but discuss problems. Helios, unable to bear it any longer, grabbed his wife and yelled for her to stop, though she didn't understand what he meant. He then declared that he knew everything, frightening her. Helios insisted that Diana stop keeping secrets and tell him the truth. Meanwhile, Hestia and Callus had returned home. As they exited the carriage, Callus admitted his uncertainty about whether he had gone too far by requesting the dukedom. Hestia then asked Callus if he still didn't trust her, since he doubted her proposal. His hesitation wasn't due to distrust, but because even the Emperor couldn't bestow such a high title without reason. The butler had invited the couple to dine, but Hestia requested a walk with her beloved. This private walk was necessary for Hestia to convey an important prophecy to Callus. Meanwhile, Helios and Diana continued to argue, as Diana claimed she didn't understand what he wanted to tell her. Helios realized his father was right. Even if Diana turned the world against her, he should stand by her side. He pleaded with her to be honest, asking directly if her divine powers were gone. Helios explained that his father knew everything. He had seen no improvement despite Diana's efforts, and thus guessed her powers had vanished. Diana, however, believed Helios had simply believed Hestia. It was through the Marquis's prophecy that he had first heard of her powers disappearing. Diana, realizing the truth, accused Hestia of betraying her confidence, as she had promised to keep the secret. According to Diana, it was Hestia who had advised her to conceal the secret from Helios for as long as possible, and she had merely followed her advice. Helios was astonished that Hestia had compelled his wife to hide the prophecy. Hestia, however, told Helios that Diana had instructed her to keep silent. Diana disagreed. Their conflicting accounts meant one of them was lying, leaving Helios to decide whom to believe. Diana continued to blame Hestia, but Helios couldn't understand why she would listen to a woman she supposedly hated. Then, Diana replied that she simply didn't know, adding that her divine powers hadn't vanished, but were merely temporarily weakened and would return. She hadn't believed the prophecy, as she believed her powers were still present. Helios remained silent, carefully considering everything. Then Crown Princess Diana began questioning him, asking if he truly didn't believe his wife, but instead believed the Marquis. The saint's words were contradictory. She initially claimed not to believe Hestia, yet she followed the Marquis's instructions while concealing the whole truth from Crown Prince Helios. There is too much evidence suggesting that Hestia's prophecy was not a lie. Helios told this to his wife, but even so, the Crown Prince remained on his beloved's side. He still wanted to protect her to the end, because he loved her, Therefore, from now on, Diana must trust her husband and not hide anything from him, as he would always be on her side. Meanwhile, Diana was thinking that despite the Crown Prince's sweet words, since he loved her, he must trust her completely. Back home, Hestia realized how tired she was, so she started to recall everything she had done throughout the day. The Marquise remembered her walk with her beloved Callus, during which she told him about a prophecy. A second provocation from another country was imminent. Although the war at the border had stopped, the second provocation would be more serious. So Callus asked Hestia if she had already reported this information to the Crown Prince. Hestia reminded her husband Callus of the first attack, which was stopped thanks to her, and after which she gained Helios's trust. Before Hestia's rebirth, when an armed conflict broke out with a neighboring country, the entire empire mourned Callus's untimely death, but he was able to return quickly and stop the war. This meant that if Callus now took diplomatic measures, the enemy would demand the right for their merchants to trade freely in their country in exchange for abandoning the war, just like the last time before Hestia's rebirth. The negotiations to end the war that time were almost humiliating. Therefore, if Callus could resolve everything through diplomacy this time, there would be a reason to grant him the title of Duke. Then Callus asked what would happen if diplomacy failed. But Hestia didn't even consider this question, as she had full confidence in her beloved Callus. Then Hestia said that if Callus didn't want to get involved in all of this, she was willing to do anything for him. Hestia was so resolute that she didn't give her husband Callus a chance to interrupt. So he tried to cover her mouth with his hand to calm her down. As a result, the Marquise was extremely embarrassed due to the awkwardness, and he hurriedly said that Euros was waiting for him and left, leaving Hestia alone. The Marquise thought about how happy she was, and then she thought about how Diana and Helios were doing now. Meanwhile, Crown Princess Diana was crying because her husband, Helios, no longer believed her, even though he had promised to always be on her side. Diana was very worried about this, because the only person the girl could rely on treated her this way. Diana was already starting to think that Helios had almost abandoned her. Then, Crown Princess Diana thought that she had to choose Callus, because with Helios, everything would end soon. Diana recalled how gently and devotedly Callus treated her. He always believed in Diana. Therefore, Crown Princess Diana decided that she needed to take Callus away from Hestia and make him hers. And while Hestia mocked Diana's blind faith, the saint herself firmly believed that she could win Callus back because the gods would arrange everything. In the original novel, there was a truly strong love between the main characters. The Marquise remembered this in the Imperial Palace Library, where all the books of the Empire were kept. And Hestia went there because her beloved Callus wanted to go there before returning to his government duties. But he didn't just go to the library, but to the secret archive inside, where confidential information was stored. The Marquise was not allowed to enter the archive, so she waited for her husband alone in the regular library. Hestia didn't expect to find a book in the library that she remembered the protagonist reading in the original story, so Hestia picked up the novel, wanting to examine it more closely. In the past, Helios always teased Diana because, among the numerous books, Diana only chose romance novels. As she was thinking about this, Crown Prince Helios approached her and asked if this was the only book that could interest the Marquise. Hestia didn't understand why Crown Prince Helios had come here, as he should have been working at this time. Then the Crown Prince explained that he had come to the library to look for some information, but happened to run into the Marquise because he wanted to talk to her. Hestia assumed it was all because of her request to grant Callus the title of Duke, so she began to apologize to the Crown Prince if he suddenly felt offended by her wish. But Crown Prince Helios explained that he had forgotten about that. But since Hestia wanted to discuss it, he started to steer the conversation towards the dukedom, even though he initially wanted to talk about something else. It turned out that the Crown Prince wanted to see the Marquise to advise her to hide her prophecy from Diana, which clearly confused Hestia. Despite the palpable awkwardness between Crown Prince Helios and Crown Princess Diana, Marquise Hestia feigned ignorance of the prince's meaning, prompting him to clarify what was wrong with her prophecy. The Crown Prince explained that his beloved Diana simply didn't believe the prophecy, to which Diana retorted by questioning why the prince heeded the Marquise's advice. Since the prince already understood which of the two women was lying, he wondered what the point of this foolish conversation was. He wouldn't hear anything new from Hestia anyway. Helios told her she was absolutely right, and that was precisely why she was irritating him more than usual. While Hestia pondered what had gotten into the Crown Prince today, he inquired if she had any further prophecies. Hestia decided to remain silent about the impending threat of war she had previously confided to Callus. If she was wrong, it could diminish her husband's potential accomplishments. Therefore, she informed the Crown Prince that the only thing she could discuss at the moment was the changing trends in fashion. Helios appeared impatient, so Hestia reassured him that prophecies were merely her interpretation of the situation. If the Crown Prince relied solely on them, he might overlook something crucial. Silence fell between them, which Hestia broke by requesting permission to leave and find her beloved. Upon learning that Callus was also in the library, the Crown Prince hurried to find him. The prince didn't get far, however, as the Marquise grabbed his arm in an attempt to stop him. The suddenness of it all resulted in Hestia accidentally bumping into Helios as he turned abruptly. Just then, Callus returned from the secret archives to find his wife practically in the Crown Prince's arms. Hestia immediately worried that her beloved might misunderstand what he saw and hastened to explain. After listening to his wife's explanations and justifications, Callus calmly replied that he understood. He then indifferently told Hestia that they should go home now, as if nothing had happened. Since Callus had correctly interpreted the situation, and Hestia no longer needed to worry about it, she could now focus on her own matters. Her thoughts were consumed with speculation about what had transpired between Helios and Diana. Hestia concluded that the prince no longer trusted his wife, as evidenced by his decision to seek information from the Marquise. She hoped that the love between the main characters had been completely shattered, but that wasn't the case. Only trust had been lost in their relationship, and even though Helios still loved his wife, he could no longer trust her, which was already a success for Hestia's plans. The Marquise was pleased that Callus hadn't misunderstood her earlier that day, but somewhere deep down, she felt a pang of sadness. It meant that she couldn't stir any emotions in her beloved's heart. But Hestia understood that she and the Marquis were merely bound by a marriage of convenience, so she shouldn't expect any feelings from him. Meanwhile, Callus himself was thinking that when he saw his wife with the Crown Prince in the library, a past scene flashed through his mind for a few seconds. The Marquis almost thought that what happened with Diana was about to repeat itself with Hestia. But then, the man saw the look of disgust on his wife's face and realized he had almost completely misunderstood. At that moment, Hestia didn't even have to explain herself, because all her feelings were revealed with just one look at her beloved. That night, both the Marquise and her beloved pondered whether they were still just contractually bound, or if their relationship was transforming into something deeper. The next day, Hestia received news so shocking that she dropped her cup. It turned out that the Crown Prince and His Majesty had invited her to a tea party.